Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
My name is Julienne Serrault. It is the 7th of January in 1882. I'm an innkeeper outside the mountain town of Briançon, at the base of the French Alps. The inn does not do much trade, and in the winter months I am sometimes alone for days at a time. In recent times I have earned a pittance delivering dry goods and sundries once a month to the abbey at St. Genest, 8 miles west. The abbey is housed in Castle Archambault, a somewhat forbidding edifice deep in the forest. In the time of Napoleon's rule, the castle had been the possession for 20 years of Count Archambault and his wife, well respected in their day and generous with their wealth. They were found dead in their bedroom after having disappeared from public for many weeks, the victims of suicide by poison. It was rumored that the Countess, Nadia by name, had dabbled in the occult and brought doom to herself and her innocent husband by seeking immortality through demonic visitations, turning the castle into an impure, accursed place, habitable only by those with total purity of spirit. All nonsense, of course, a tale conjured by fools to cruelly cast doubt upon the sincerity of the Count's donations of his land and riches to a church neither he nor his wife had any dealings with in life. The abbess of St. Genest, Mother Henriette, was a gregarious woman who invariably came out to meet my wagon during a delivery and always insisted on helping me with the load, while she entertained me with the latest joke she'd heard from the man who helped the sisters tend their expansive gardens. I grew fond of her over the 2 years I delivered to the abbey, sometimes taking the sisters' handmade crafts and pies back with me to sell at the inn. One afternoon, in November, I loaded up my wagon with barley, rice, cabbages, and pears, and began the 90-minute trek to the abbey to drop off the month's supplies. I got an unusually late start, and night fell as I went, the remnants of a recent snowfall settling in the woods all around me. As usual, I passed no one on my journey. The weather in these parts is unpredictable enough from October to April to dissuade any casual travelers from venturing too far into the forest. I arrived at Gola Road as day became night. The tall spires of the castle became visible through the trees a half-mile away. The road sloped upwards gradually, and a man on foot would be exhausted upon reaching the castle's front gate. This time, Mother Henriette was waiting for me just off the road, most likely having spotted the wagon from one of the castle's high windows. She laughed at my tardiness and informed me that the abbey was not accepting overnight guests, no matter the color of my coin. She opened the gate so I could proceed to the storehouse, where 2 of the sisters would assist me in unloading the goods. I never felt less humbled on the castle grounds. Small, before its immensity, although it was surely of modest size when compared with some in the Alps. When we were done and I was to be on my way, Mother Henriette approached me, holding something in her arms, something swaddled in a blue blanket. She introduced me to what she called her little friend, a baby deer that had wandered onto the ground seeking shelter. She held it fondly and maternally, explaining that the sisters had little choice but to watch after it until it could survive on its own, as its mother had never appeared. Peering through the growing dark, I saw the deer was sleeping, its head almost completely enclosed and snug under the blanket. I told Mother Henriette I was surprised the baby wasn't awake and alert in the bitter cold, and she said she worried about that too. The poor creature often slept for hours and hours at a time. I reached a hand under the blanket and touched its little head. For some reason, the deer's body was incredibly warm to the touch, disturbingly so. I mentioned this too to Mother Henriette, and she concurred. All they could do was pray for the beast and take care of it as best they could. And that was my November visit to the abbey. I reached the inn by 7 o'clock and settled in for the night with a book. After falling asleep, I fell prey to some terrifying dreams. I came awake well past midnight, trying to shake a vision of a gigantic undersea monstrosity crashing through the bow of a ship on which I was a mate. At the sound of a crewman screaming and the bow splitting, dooming all on board to death in the ocean, my eyes opened in my bedroom. I managed to fall asleep once again, but yet another nightmare came for me. I was tied to the ground in the woods at night, and a man whose head was encaged in a bizarre metal apparatus approached me, holding a baby high above his head. I was begging this man not to harm it, but he then stood over me, the baby crying and kicking. And without a word, he slammed that poor little child down upon my left arm, undoubtedly killing the infant with the awful force of the strike. I awoke at that exact moment, a dog howling somewhere far away in the forest. I lay in my bed quite still for a moment, feeling a strange tingling in my left arm, as if in fact it had been struck. Then, perhaps 5 seconds after this terrible dream ended, an excruciating bolt of pain leapt up my arm from fingers to shoulder. A second bolt followed the first, and I rose from my bed in a panic, moving my arm into the moonlight that streamed through my window. What I beheld caused me to cry out in horror. My arm was twisted around so drastically, it was as if God himself had attached it to my body incorrectly. It had also broken in 2 places, white bone protruding just below my elbow. I managed to stagger 3 steps forward, but then collapsed to my knees, weeping in agony, having no understanding of what could have happened to me. The thought that perhaps an intruder had broken in and assaulted me flitted in and out of my fevered mind, but it simply could not be. There came a final, grievous bodily injury I did not even feel at first, but which asserted itself there in the dark only when I began to stumble down the stairs to the inn's bottom floor. Some of the fingers of my left hand and my entire palm had been burned red, as if I had doused it all in boiling water. Only 3 or 4 days later did I become certain that the afflicted flesh corresponded exactly to that which had touched the tiny deer brought to me by Mother Henriette. Not 10 minutes after discovering my injuries, I made my way out to my horse and climbed onto his back with great effort, so as not to have my arm strike his side. I had made no effort to wrap it. It would have been too painful. I, somehow, rode 4 miles to a veterinarian, whom I knew lived in a small cottage by the main road, urging my horse to a gallop despite the fact that such jostling caused me great agony. I simply could not take my time. The veterinarian's wife answered my plaintive knocking. Though the man himself was away, she had learned much from him over the years, and somehow she was able to set my arm just well enough so that I could get 2 hours' rest beside the hearth and set off at dawn, she plying me with narcotic whiskey from the moment I entered the saintly woman's home. My injuries were slow to heal, but heal they did. It was immensely difficult to operate the inn with just 1 young hired hand as I recovered, but I hosted only 3 guests in late November, along with the semi-nightly visitors whose numbers I could normally count on 1 hand. I told those who inquired that I had fallen off a ladder while conducting a repair on the roof of the building, always privately musing upon what could possibly have caused the affliction. Nothing made any sense. Especially puzzling was the conundrum of the burns on my hand. The pain from these marks had faded quickly, but the redness remained for almost a week. On the 12th of December, a carpenter named Gorski delivered a message to me from the Abbey. It was in Mother Henriette's hand. In the note, she told me that illness had overcome many of the sisters, including herself, and that it was best if I not make my monthly goods delivery at all. She explained that they had more than enough stores to last another few weeks and that it was not worth the risk to my health to come out and make contact. I asked Gorski how Mother Henriette had given him the letter, and he said it had simply been nailed to a post beside the Abbey's front gate, with a request that it be delivered to me. I thanked him, a bit worried, as the nature of the illness Mother Henriette mentioned remained a mystery. Most likely a virus had laid them low, perhaps almost all of the 19 women who lived in the castle. More troublesome was the possibility that a sudden snowfall might cut me off from the sisters for an extra week, or even 2 or 3 possibly. If I was not able to get there on schedule and such a storm occurred, I knew they might go hungry, being desperately poor. Despite the worth of Castle Archambault, its inhabitants themselves possessed nothing beyond what they needed to survive, and I knew them often to be in ill health because their most basic nutritional needs sometimes went unfulfilled. I awaited further news, but the next time Gorski passed by, he said he'd seen no more communications outside the Abbey's gate as he'd made his way past the day before. Sitting with a glass of schnapps, he did mention he'd seen one thing that had given him pause. He labored to describe it to me, uncertain as to how to convey the image in words and unsure of what to make of it. The sun had been low in the sky as he trotted on his horse up Gola Road, the horizon orange and red, throwing everything into sharp relief. In a high room, he'd seen 2 silhouettes, feminine ones. They were engaged in a frenetic sort of dance, he thought. Though that wasn't quite right. They were locked at the arms and were spinning fast, their heads cocked back, one body urging the other toward greater and greater speed. There was nothing in this act, Gorski said, that suggested playfulness or joy. Trees had blocked his view rather quickly, and he had been unable to get another look at this anomaly. I asked him to tell me the story again, more carefully this time, but again it led nowhere, except into the parts of the imagination that pondered such enigmas, only in the lonely minutes before sleep. It was approximately the 23rd of December when a most unusual visitor came to my establishment. At that time, after a snowfall of 14 inches over the course of a single Saturday, no guests were staying at the inn, and no one at all had come in for drink or refreshment in 2 days. Only when the weather warmed in late April would the inn become busy again, and my life less afflicted with banal solitude. On the night I write of here, the front door opened at about 10 o'clock, and a tall man entered, kicking snow off his boots. He offered a subdued greeting and asked if I had a room available for the night, and if I could tend to his horse. He was traveling to Font Christian, and would set out again in the morning, but he simply could not abide the wind and cold he'd come through under a waning moon. I offered him a key, and he asked me to prepare him any sort of meal if it was possible, a cold one being adequate. After I stoked the fire, I went into the kitchen to fix some turtle soup and boiled potatoes. When I emerged into the front room with this modest repast, my guest was sitting at the table closest to the fire, gazing into it, appearing utterly exhausted. His face and his hands were chapped from the cold. He was perhaps 50 years old, had a thick red beard and somewhat sad eyes. I asked him how far he had traveled on this night, privately amazed that he should be out at all with the snow still so deep on the road. 6 or 7 miles, he said, especially concerned that his horse be well fed. I went to complete this errand, assuring him the animal would be given a suitable place to sleep for the night. He had finished his meal by the time I returned, and he thanked me softly as I cleared his plate. I led him to his room, which was just down a short hallway. As I was taking my leave of him, he asked me something, finally speaking more than a few words. He asked me if I had any dealings with the abbey at the northern end of Gola Road. I said that yes, for almost 2 years I delivered dry goods there on a monthly basis. He frowned severely, became keenly attentive. And had I gone there recently? He wanted to know. I explained that I had not, and told him about Mother Henriette's note. He advised me then to stay away from the abbey even if I did not hear from her again. He had just come from there this very night. A terrible sickness had befallen the sisters, he said, and it was vital that no one go near them. I asked him when it would be safe to visit them once again, expressing my fears that they might not have enough to eat. His response, spoken in a tired and deeply sorrowful voice, was that I should consider the poor women lost. I was flabbergasted. Lost, he said again. He had not been able to heal them. So he was a doctor then, I realized, and the satchel he carried was his medical kit. He bade me good night and closed the door. I walked back to my own room, unable to fully internalize the ghastly news. I did not even worry for myself, my own health. I wondered what sort of god would allow this to happen to such pious women, but, of course, disease has taken away many people of my acquaintance. The Abbey was a most difficult place to live, its unfeeling stone a cruel conductor of the winter chill. I would try to learn more as time went on. The thought occurred to me that perhaps the nuns' adoption of a wild animal, even one so seemingly harmless, has brought them a devastating illness. I still remembered its odd and inexplicable warmth to my touch, and the troubling imprint it had left upon my person. It was the very next day after my guest had left the inn without a word before I even awoke, merely leaving payment on a dining table, that someone came after him. I was asleep upstairs at 9 a.m, having drunk too much the night before while musing upon the fate of Mother Henriette and the sisters. I roused myself upon hearing a faraway knock, wincing at the residual pain in my left arm that accompanied my every hour, and opened the front door to find a lad, perhaps 18, standing at the doorstep, weighed down by a heavy saddlebag. He asked me if Father Seraph were still here, or if he had ridden on across La Durance. I told him I did not know Father Seraph, but the lad seemed to believe he had stayed at the inn the night before. Soon enough, it became apparent from the young man's physical description of my guest that the man had not been a doctor at all, but a servant of the cloth. The lad wanted to deliver a message from him from Pra Morel. He shortly went on his way, visibly upset at the thought of having to follow him through the snow all the way to Font Christian. As the days passed, and the precious few who came to the inn seemed to have no more information about the Abbey, I became more and more troubled by the silence. Despite Father Seraph's warnings, I knew I would have to at least ride past the castle to confirm to myself that there was no way I could help the sisters. No way at all. I had decided upon a Monday morning to set out on this task, but upon stepping outside an hour after dawn, I could see the mists over the mountains swirling ominously, and I knew the snow was about to blow in on high winds. 11 inches fell before nightfall, and the wind screamed as it swept down the Hemwick Lane, stranding me at the inn for another 3 full days filled with loneliness and troubled thoughts. On Tuesday night, I set about a thorough cleaning of the inn's 5 empty rooms in an attempt to take my mind off such disconcerting matters. In the room that had been most recently inhabited by a young and very friendly scholar who had been passing through and compiling notes for a book about the episcopacy in Western Europe, I found 2 books that he had left beside in haste or absent-mindedness. One of these was a colorful local history of our region, penned by a man named Gascoigne. I knew of him, actually. He had taught at my school when I was but a lad of 17. I took a chair by the fire and paged through it, ashamed of my lack of knowledge of the area where I had lived and done business for more than 25 years. When I caught sight of a mention of Count Archambault, I read more slowly and observantly. There was a detailed account of the nobleman's improvements to the land and the general area around it during his life, as well as the revisions he had engineered concerning the way the people of Briançon were represented in government. But the pages also bore mention of his curious death, beside his wife, who had also expired from poisoning, almost certainly by their own hand. 5 years after they passed, and 1 year before the church officially took possession of the land according to Archambault's will after much legal dispute, the castle was inhabited by a respectable family named Lautrec. They became the center of a mystery, as all 9 family members disappeared without a trace sometime in the year 1809, including 2 young children. Those who came to the castle in response to a curious lack of communication found the place well appointed as always, but completely empty. The family's horses unfed and dying. No explanation for their vanishing, and no trace of any of them was ever found. It was at this time that whispers of some satanic influence within the castle took hold as never before, and those who believed that Nadia Archambault had been a witch had their notions entertained for decades. In the minds of the superstitious, she was a craven temptress whose true ambition had been to reach out from beyond the grave, to consume the souls of the living. From what Gascoigne could surmise, much of the slander that stained her name had grown as a response to her social reticence and her rather frightful appearance. She was described as a wisp of a creature, pale as sleet, with a piercing gaze. There was the apocryphal tale of a soldier boarding in Briancon who, struggling on foot through the great storm of 1801 to reach his declining mother, saw the castle rising in the distance against the stars, and trudged up the Gola road in the hope that someone might offer him a bed for the night. According to the legend, dutifully reported by Gascoigne's rambling history, the soldier saw through the blowing snow a small woman, wearing neither coat, nor hat, nor gloves, standing with her back to him in the center of the road. When he reached her, she turned and touched his chest with a bony finger, issuing him an invitation to lay with her in the castle, where she would show him all the passageways she had created for the one she called the Conqueror. On her forehead was marked an inverted cross. The soldier fled this woman, and upon seeing a portrait of Countess Archambault long after her death, swore that it had been she whom he'd seen that night. Had he not supposedly been one of Napoleon's most trusted captains by that time, the story would certainly have been resigned to the ages without a fuss. As I write these words, it is 4:10 a.m. on the 7th of January. I find myself writing as much as possible about what came well before the last 4 hours, so as to put off the final accounting of what I have so recently seen and heard. Nothing matters in the end but what is real, not conjecture or rumor. After finally making it to the castle and witnessing all my mortal heart could bear, I have now returned to the safety of the inn, and can do nothing now but tell the truth and report all that I saw on this mournful, godless night, if only to this journal. I could not leave for the Abbey until my hired helper came to the inn to host anyone who might visit, so it wasn't until almost 8 o'clock that I set out for Castle Archambault. I loaded my wagon with some goods for the sisters in the unlikely case the information I had been given was completely wrong, and they could use the assistance. The weather was passable when I left, with low winds coming from the east. A crisp but not terribly unpleasant night. On the way, I saw someone coming down the road in the other direction. A solitary man on horseback, who was singing very softly to himself. Aside from this man, I saw no one. I reached the Abbey's gate at about 9:30. Having traveled more slowly than normal, giving myself every chance to turn around, thinking of all the reasons I could not be on this errand. Moving on to Gola Road, I actually stopped briefly when I could spy the upper part of the castle against the sky. But in the end, I overcame my superstitions. The first thing I noticed through the trees that fronted the castle, troublingly, was that there was not a single light to be seen in any of its windows. Usually, the sisters lit candles well before dusk and placed one behind every pane, more for the benefit of travelers than themselves. It had always been a comforting sight to see, an image of warmth and humanity on this frigid, somnolent road. that stretched for miles in either direction without any glimpse of something welcoming. Now, there was just a bloodless phantasm. The building looked as if it had been empty for 100 years. It would be very cold inside. The stone walls chilling one to the core. The low iron gate in front was closed but not locked. Not a terribly unusual happenstance. I left the wagon and my horse behind and moved through it, approaching the front door, which I had never actually parted. In my right hand, I held a kerosene lantern, having prepared myself for the dark. Embedded in the door was a heavy knocker, shaped like an owl, which I struck 5 times against the wood. I waited. No one came, but I had not expected a response. I pushed gently on the door and realized it was not even fully shut. There was no visible gap between the door and the jamb, but someone had obviously not noticed that it had never been closed. Or perhaps it had intentionally been left open. I entered Castle Archambault for the first time. All was black within. Closing the door behind me against the light wind, I found myself in a long, draughty front hall that stretched left and right. The gloom enshrouded me, and my lantern could not show me anything that was not less than 5 feet in front of me. The walls around me were 100-year-old gray stone, virtually devoid of ornamentation of any kind. I called out a greeting, my words echoing with a sad hollowness, and I received nothing in return. I chose to move to my left down the hall, stepping carefully, my eyes trained mostly downward. The floor was scratched and in many places not quite level with the earth. My foot came to rest on dead winter leaves once or twice, a sign that perhaps the front door had been left open wider and longer than it had even first seemed. The sisters would certainly have swept them out right away. I knew it was true then, but they had all perished. I needed little more proof. I wondered if Father Seraph had at least sent men to give them all Christian burials before leaving the castle to its uneasy repose. The hallway ended at a short flight on curving steps. I ascended them, surprised at the din of my boots on the stone. Before me was a short corridor with a single room on each side. I moved forward. That was when I heard something. A faint musical note coming from the end of the corridor. Someone was at a piano, and from the depths of despair my heart leapt with hope. The same high G was being keyed again and again at 3 or 4 second intervals meaninglessly. I followed the note down the corridor, past closed doors bearing empty sconces. This hallway ended up ahead in a room with no barrier to entry. Holding the lantern high, I began to make out the shapes of furniture, and then its details. What I entered was a sitting room with 2 straight-back chairs and little else. Turning and casting the beam of the lantern to my right, I beheld the origin of the music. One of the sisters sat at a small piano, the index finger on her right hand resting gently on that G key. She lifted it and recited, striking the note again for the 7th or 8th time. There was something deeply wrong with the woman, as I saw instantly. She was completely unclothed from head to toe, as she sat there in this tenebrous enclosure. My puny light revealed a naked and emaciated body. I would have looked away in shame had my eyes not been drawn irrevocably to her face. The sister, one of the younger ones at the Abbey, appeared blindfolded. But then, looking harder, I saw the truth of the matter was that she had been crudely and haphazardly bandaged around the eyes. She was utterly blind as she sat there, naked and unaware of my presence. She must have been freezing, But of it, she gave no sign. I did not know what to say, or if I should say anything at all, and meekly withdraw. But then, she sensed my presence, and took her finger from that solitary key. The sound of the note faded to nothing, and there was silence, save for the sound of the wind sighing through the castle's hidden crevices. Slowly, she turned her head in my direction. The bones in her face protruded unflatteringly, and her lip had been bloodied. She said to me, softly, pleasantly, as if nothing in the slightest was wrong, "Who is it that has come to visit the sisters?" For a moment I was taken aback to respond. Finally, I managed to nervously utter my name and state where I had come from, the plume of my breath visible before me. I apologized for my presence and assured her I would withdraw from the abbey immediately if she wished it. Out of shame, I raised the lantern higher so as to direct its feeble glow only above her neck. But instead of asking me to retreat, she offered a slow, sickly smile. Even though she could not see, she seemed to be looking directly at me. She bade me stay, and meet the others. I swallowed hard. I could see a drop of moisture high on her cheek, and moving just a little closer could determine that I was looking at blood. I asked the sister if she desired a blanket or food from my wagon, or even medical assistance. I could not stop myself from asking what was wrong with her eyes. She tilted her head strangely. She said that of course she had torn them out as soon as she had been able. Certain that I had misheard, I leaned in even closer and asked her to repeat her words. When she did, in a chiding tone that made me feel like a child caught not paying attention, I asked her why she had done such a terrible thing. I was barely able to get the words out. She said that the nighttime was a tolerable time, but that in the day, all the sisters saw much too much of this hideous world. I stood in stunned silence. I was about to offer my coat, nervous at the very thought of getting so near to this deranged woman, when she rose from the wooden bench in one swift motion. She was more emaciated than I had ever thought at first, and a streak of wet dirt ran from her exposed hip and down her right knee. She excused herself, told me she was terribly late for Vespers, and suddenly took off in a run past me, moving trustingly into the dark, arms outstretched. Instinctively, I reached out to her, my fingers only brushing her shoulder, which was so cold to the touch that I would have believed her to be a corpse. She left the room and moved down the hallway, intent on leaving me behind. Mortified, I remained where I was. The light of the lantern gave me the last glimpse of her I would ever have. Her short, ragged black hair matted to her skull as she vanished, feet making soft padding sounds on the stone. It was fear that kept me in place. Fear that had already overwhelmed my sense of concern and compassion. Being there in the abbey felt like being in a tomb. I knew that if I turned fully in the direction the sister had fled, I would continue at the front door, climb into my wagon, leave, and never return. So, I forced myself to stand perfectly still and reclaim my nerves. 30 seconds passed. Then a full minute. I shone the light around the room. There was a thin door set into the rear wall, and I went to it. As I touched the knob, I felt a draft swirl around my legs and heard the sound of a single leaf tumbling across the stone nearby. I moved through the door and closed it behind me, trying intently not to let it make a strong sound as I latched. I did not remember the turns I took then, never daring to venture up the stairs that sometimes concluded a hallway's length. Climbing deeper into the castle before I was aware of all that was truly around me seemed a daunting and frightening undertaking. I dreaded the way the castle so effectively hid what lay ahead of me, reluctantly revealing itself in cryptic patches and sections before the slowly weakening kerosene flame. I had no more than 5 more minutes navigating the lonesome abbey's narrow passageways before I received another, more ghastly shock. Suddenly the lantern's light fell upon 2 livid faces in the dark. I stopped short in my tracks, my heart thrumming. A pair of women stood under an archway, their backs against a cragged stone wall. They too were naked, scrawny, and they too had crudely bandaged their eyes with strips of torn cloth. Moving the lantern slightly to my left caused 3 more faces to appear, all of them sisters of Saint Genest, once serene and humble servants of God, now unclothed, sick, with some illness that had no name, and perhaps utterly insane. Almost all of them possessed a sinister grin that belied their sorry condition. The oldest of the sisters, perhaps 70 years in age, spoke. She said how delightful it was that someone other than Father Seraph should visit them, and perhaps bring them treats. She hoped whoever stood before them now would be kinder than Father Seraph had been, less given to judgment. I did not respond until another sister asked my name. I gave it. One of them offered apology that Mother Henriette was not here to receive me. When I asked where she was, another replied that she had been among the first to offer herself up for feeding. I asked what that meant, and the older sister barked out hoarse laughter. "We must show him," she said. "It is almost time that we fed the baby in any case." One of the group, a woman whose scarlet hair hung down completely covering her face, clapped her hands like a schoolgirl. She said in a voice almost completely strangled my pneumonia that it had become very difficult to decide who was to be fed to the baby, because everyone wanted so much to be chosen. Perhaps I could decide for them. It would be a kind of game. Feeling my own voice about to abandon me from fear, I summoned it forcefully and told the sisters before me that I was ready and willing to transport them all to the care of doctors, and that I felt there should be no delay in this regard. "Oh, we hear so much of doctors," the oldest exclaimed harshly. "But we are so happy here, until the last of us has been eaten." Another stepped forward. Her bandages were cinched so tightly around her eyes that the flesh on the borders had gone red, perhaps from infection. I jerked back, as if a snake were approaching me. "Perhaps," this one said, "the first among us to find him and touch him in the dark would be allowed to experience the feeding this time." This thought occasioned a titter amongst them all, and my very blood slowed in my veins. Giggling, 2 more stepped forward, reaching out playfully. Their hands were filthy, as if they had been clawing in the dirt in the frozen garden outside. I shouted at them to stay back. At this, they seemed to freeze in mid-motion, and expressions of surprise and genuine offense crossed their sallow faces. And then there was silence. Then, the eldest said that if I did not wish to play, I could not speak during the choosing. "Come, sisters, to the great hall, so we can finish tonight's event," she said. They all turned to the north, toward the direction I had originally been set on, and moved as swiftly as their blindness allowed towards some unknown destination. I followed, amazed and dismayed at how easily they made their way. as if they'd been blind since birth. Only one of them seemed to need her hands to feel her way, and I wondered in some dim corner of my mind if perhaps she had been the most recent to take out her eyes, or beg another to perform this task. The agony of that act must have caused their frail bodies to decline that much more quickly. All were near death, I knew. At what point Father Seraph had given up on these wretches was a mystery. Perhaps he had been here for only a few minutes, or perhaps even days before he had judged the sisters beyond hope, living cadavers to be abandoned. But it seemed bizarre to me that he'd simply not had them taken in, committed, to be later healed. There was nothing contagious here, it seemed. The real illness nested deep inside their minds. I followed them until dim light appeared up ahead, then I hesitated before moving forward again. We were entering the center part of the castle, the great main room where Count Archambault and his wife had once staged lavish balls. The room was gigantic, cavernous, and full of moonlight shone through frosted windows built into the high ceiling. The furnishings here consisted of nothing more than 7 or 8 wooden tables, ranked along the walls so that the entire floor space was open, lending the place an intense echo and a miasma of gloom and desolation. The brain-sick sisters gathered in the center of the space in a pool of that moonlight, seeming to know just where to stop. The eldest clapped her hands and said, "Now, who shall it be tonight?" One sister spoke up quickly, offering that she should be the one to end her life since she had been the coldest for so many nights. And sometimes, she could still make out shadows through one of her eyes, which was too great a burden to bear. This woman's bandage had slipped down some from her brow, and I had seen a terrible indentation and scar there that had not fully healed. Despite the protest of 2 other sisters, the eldest silenced them and said it was just that this sufferer be released from her bonds and should be offered to the baby tonight. At these words, the volunteer beamed, but then expressed her concern that the baby might not be awake to receive her. The eldest said they must call to him to make sure he awoke. There came the most horrible, most haunting hymn I have ever heard expressed by human voices, as the sisters began in unison a grim performance of some song I feel no man on earth has ever heard, an eerie, atonal convocation in a language utterly unfamiliar to my ear. They all knew every word by heart and sang with their faces to the ceiling, their bodies rigid. I cannot prove but would swear on the King James Bible that the sky as glimpsed through the windows above changed ever so slightly, becoming tinged with a murky crimson color for just a moment, as the song faded blessedly into nothing but a ghostly echo. It might only have been an anomaly in the adjustment of my night vision to the unfamiliar surroundings, but it had been so vivid that this change in the sky and nothing other was what had caused me to look upwards. No sound I would ever hear again could be so disturbing, or so I thought in that instant, for what followed was indeed worse. At the eastern end of the space was a pair of huge oaken doors that must have led out into the courtyard where I had sometimes left my deliveries. Bordering that courtyard, I remembered, was a lovely garden that in spring hosted a profusion of daffodils and irises. The eldest sister turned in my direction and said that if I was still here, now I would see how well they had all fed the baby, who had come to them as a tiny and wounded victim of this unforgiving world. Almost immediately after she spoke, I heard from beyond those doors a shifting movement, as of something of great size coming forward. After that came the sound that sent a thunderous shiver all through me, causing my recovering left arm to ache, and my flesh to tingle so sharply it was as if I had been stung by 1,000 bees. There was a baritone animal grunt from the courtyard, and then a low, shaky growl, throatier than a grown lion's. I should have fled then, but instead, I watched as the naked volunteer strode without hesitation toward the doors, even the soft pads of her feet creating echoes. The sister encouraged her as she groped clumsily for the heavy wooden beam that served as a locking mechanism and barred whatever beast that crouched in the cold outside from entering the castle. With whatever strength she had left in her broken body, the damned woman lifted the beam and pushed her way out into the night. Leaves rushed in and the wind curled its icy fingers around me. The sisters seemed unaffected as they clapped and called out happy goodbyes, never calling the poor volunteer by her given name. The right-hand door swung backward and, aided by the wind, slammed heavily shut. From outside there came a high-pitched, twisting, rising animal shriek, causing me to seal my eyes shut and turn away, tears spilling down my cheeks. The creature, the baby, that had gorged itself on human flesh and soul to become a behemoth, snarled, and I thought I heard a wet clamping sound, and a thought of something hitting earth. I ran then, abandoning the women to whatever horrors fate had in store for them. Thrusting the lantern forward, I forced myself to move as fast as my feet would carry me. The worst thing I could possibly do was to take a wrong turn in that accursed labyrinth, and yet it happened. Beyond the sitting room where I had encountered the woman at the piano, I went stupidly in the wrong direction, which I realized quickly when I came to an intersection that would take me either east or west, from a wall on which hung a painting depicting the selling of Joseph into Egyptian slavery. As I turned, I looked behind me to quickly make certain I was not being followed. The light fell across something in the shadows, something only 3 feet in front of my face. I had missed it in the dark. I was looking at a pair of legs attached to a nude body hanging from an overhead beam. One of the sisters, whom I recall as an enthusiastic helper and assisting with my deliveries, dangled at the end of a piece of shredded blanket, her eyes open and gazing directly at me through soiled black hair. I looked at her for more than a moment, sparing no more time for pity, and then retraced my steps. Soon I found myself again in the front corridor. There the temperature within the abbey was at its coldest, digging into the very marrow of my bones, yet I felt impossibly graced to make out the main door with my ever-evolving vision. My lantern, which by now produced no more than a candle's glow, extinguished itself just then, having lasted exactly as long as I had needed it, for which I will be eternally thankful to whatever force delivered me from that interior hell. I pushed on the door and went out into the night. The droplets of snow that had been sifting down from the sky upon my arrival had become larger flakes, promising a prolonged fall. As I neared my wagon, I endured the final jolt of seeing 2 human shapes coming towards me. Nothing more at first than indistinguishable shadows. I halted and prepared to defend myself however I could from harm, but was immeasurably relieved to find that these were 2 healthy men, heavily fortified against the winter conditions by many layers of heavy clothing. One of them carried what looked like a hunting rifle, the other a strange pistol. They both bore long blades on their hips. He commanded me to remain where I was while they approached. I did as he requested, and it was now a stranger's turn to raise a lantern to illuminate my own terrified face. After I identified myself to the gun-bearer, who was quite young, while his companion was well advanced in years, He told me that they had come at the behest of Father Seraph, and they intended to do what needed to be done inside the Abbey. Understanding at once that their intention was merciless violence, I urged them to reconsider their course, pleading for mercy for the sisters, however insane they had become. And did they realize, I asked them, that there was a force here, beyond our comprehension, something monstrous and perilous, that might even now be roaming the castle grounds? To this, the younger man replied that they were aware of precisely what they had come to confront. Father Seraph had instructed them carefully, and as representatives of the church, their hands and hearts would be sure. Just as I had mistaken Father Seraph for a doctor, so now I had mistaken priests for common men. They would not leave until it had all been resolved, and the Abbey was cleansed of the devil's touch. With this, they brushed past me and headed inside. I watched until they parted that heavy door, the old man following the younger, carrying just the one lantern between them. The time had come to preserve my own life and never return to the Abbey, and I did not wish to hear a single gunshot ring out in this once holy place. The ride back to the inn held nothing fearful beyond the harsh elements and the hidden mysteries of the forest. I sit here now, in my room, as the first blue hints of dawn tinge the sky, marking it exactly 7 hours since I left the Abbey. I wish now that I had urged the men to come to the inn when they had completed their infernal work, so that I could know they had managed to leave the sisters without coming to mortal harm. I have no way of knowing if they were successful in returning the Abbey to the state it knew after the strange death of Count Archambault, and before 4 generations of nuns called it their home, a state of emptiness and hollow echoes, neither whispers of good nor evil. How I wished you strangers would soon knock on my door, seeking food and drink and rooms where they could sleep off their exhaustion. I cannot rest tonight knowing that there's still a chance that Father Seraph himself might be the next to come, to stand on my doorstep and inquire after those men, ask me if I knew why they had never returned from their nighttime journey into the forest. Worse still, perhaps the knock that comes from outside will be softer, weaker, that of a frail and eyeless woman who wishes me to visit her once again before she offers herself to a sinister entity no one living dares name.
All Joe Jenkins wanted was to go to bed. Work had been tough on him, and lunch hardly edible. Not to mention his car's CD player, yes, CD player, was broken, and no radio station was playing Alice in Chains on a loop like he would have liked. All Joe Jenkins wished for at that moment in time was to lay down and cuddle to his sleeping wife, right after tucking Josephine in. Professional letdowns aside, it went as fairy tale perfect as it did every evening. Joe would enter his daughter's room, would chat a little about how her day went, then kiss her on the forehead and wish her pleasant dreams. Those almond-shaped green eyes were his entire world, and neither a stressful day at work nor a speeding ticket would stop Joe from giving his baby girl her goodnight kiss. "Daddy, I think there's something under my bed." It was the same as every night. Joe was getting a little tired of it, but even so, he was her hero. So, he did what every hero would have done and got on his knees. "There's nothing for you to worry, honey. There's nothing under..." And there she was. From under the bed, his frightened little girl whispered with teary green eyes, "Daddy, I think there's something on my bed." All Joe Jenkins asked for was for a quiet, peaceful good night's sleep. He knew that website well, the website where all the world's shortest horror stories were posted. Being the bored security guard he was, he would always indulge in those stories during work. What else was he to do, except scanning IDs and taking good looks at the 20 or so individuals going in and out of the office building for the entirety of his 10-hour shift? Reading short horror stories was a good way to pass the time, and funny enough, this scenario was exactly one of them. The thing is, the author of that particular story never wrote what was to happen after the parent gets up. Joe Jenkins felt all the liquid in his body boil. He had no choice, however. Joe was a skeptic to the bone, but not even the mind of a skeptic is immune to a hypothesis. Joe felt like he was risking being eaten alive as he lifted his upper body to look on the bed again. All of his 180 pounds of muscle shook in the process, but no monster in sight, just his beautiful little Josie waiting for him to tell her that everything's fine, that nobody's there. Joe was still shaking. What the hell was going on? Was his mind playing tricks on him? He ducked down and looked under the bed anew. Can I come out now, Daddy? It's cold down here. His heart was breaking seeing her that way. But what was he to do? When's your birthday? Both girls answered simultaneously. 18th of May? 18th of May? Joe cursed under his breath. If this was a dream, it was time to wake up. But this couldn't have been a dream. He could remember everything that happened prior that day, and the picture before him was not milky at the edges as dreams usually are. This was real. A real nightmare. Come out of there, baby. The baby part slipped out involuntarily. How could he tell which one was his real baby? They were absolutely identical. Josie let out a high-pitched yelp when she saw another Josie rise from underneath her bed. It's all right, honey, Joe assured her. Daddy's here. There's no need for you to be scared. Sit up, please. She did as she was told, never taking her gaze off her doppelganger. Josie from under the bed hid behind her father with the self-composure of a deer in the middle of a wolf gathering. It's all right. It's okay. It's just a misunderstanding. Joe's mind was wheeling. Go take a seat next to her, please. Both Josies began to protest lively as tears swelled up their irises. Neither of them wanted to approach the other. Quiet! Go sit over there. I need to think. The girls went silent, even though their quiet sobs would escape from between their lips as the distance between them got smaller. The Josie on the bed grabbed the headboard as if her life depended on it. The other Josie approached the bed very warily and sat down so far from the other that she would have fallen off the bed if her feet weren't supporting her from the floor. Both girls were staring daggers into the other, the amount of fear in their eyes undeniable and identically genuine. Joe Jenkins looked at the one on the right and the one on the left. He got closer and looked at the one on the left and then at the one on the right. He was a security guard, for Pete's sake. Weird noises coming from the office building when everybody else was gone never scared him, but this was on a whole different level. There was no denying it. One of them was the real Josephine and the other one an otherworldly imposter. Which was which, however, he couldn't tell, and it was shattering him into millions of pieces. What kind of a father couldn't tell his beloved child from a fake? Not him. He'll be able to tell which is which in no time. Josie? Both Josies looked his way expectantly. One of you is telling the truth. The other one is lying. Joe saw this in a cartoon once. He thought the trick was brilliant, even though he never imagined he'd need it in real life. If you were the other, which one would you say is the real Josie? The two girls exchanged a glance, then looked at their father, dead determined to prove to him that the other one is the liar. She would say that she's the real Josie. So would she, Daddy. She would say she's the real Josie. Joe bit the inside of his cheek. Of course it didn't work, and it was stupid of him to believe that it would. Please, scooch closer to each other. The hurricane of cried-out no's would have been enough to wake Jane up, but his wife was the last thing on his mind at the moment. "Girls, I'm losing my nerve here. Either you get closer to each other, or I'm leaving the room and turning the light off on my way out." The two girls went silent and scooched next to each other so fast the bed sheet almost caught fire. Joe crouched in front of them. Everything about the two girls was identical. Even the thin streak of blonde hair and the long, straight, light brown mane. Even the two small yellow dots in their left eyes. "Please show me your knees." Both girls lifted their nighties above their knees. Good Lord. It was there, on both of them. A deep purple spot in the shape of a whale on their right knees. It was from last week, when Josie practiced riding her new bike without the helping wheels and went straight into the mailbox. "I need to see your left shoulders." The girls complied. And there it was again. 2 identical scars from the vaccination right after birth. "Open your mouths and stick out your tongues." And so they did, and funny enough, Joe was deeply disappointed to see no pool of never-ending darkness in either cavity. The insides of their mouths were perfectly identical. Tongue, throat, straight milk-white teeth. Jesus. Even their left canines were slightly bent in the same direction. He grabbed his daughter on the left and glued his ear to her chest. A scared little heart, beating rapidly. He grabbed the one on the right and repeated the process. A little heart beating just as fast and just as frightened as the other one. Joe was desperate and frustrated and so scared he debated with himself if he should ask Jane if she hid the existence of Josie's twin from him or something. It was crazy, but so was the picture before him. "That's it. I'm getting your mother." And just as he got up and took 2 steps towards the door, "I can prove I'm the real Josie, Daddy." His daughter on the right got to her feet, shivering. The one on the left seemed less scared and more curious. Joe looked straight in the eyes of the one who spoke. "How?" "Last week, I asked you to keep a secret for me. A secret only you and me know." Josie on the left went googly-eyed. It was true. Josie told Joe a week before that she will never go to college. Ever. She told him that when she grows up, she'll be perfectly happy with working at the 7-Eleven at the end of their street, and that now that he knows this, he and Mommy can stop fighting about money. What Josie didn't know is that Joe had already told this secret to Jane. It had been a long conversation. They laughed about it, cried about it, and apologized to each other for always arguing about finances. Best sex Joe ever had. And just as he was about to grab his daughter on the right and drag her away from the abomination on the left Josie blurted out the entirety of the secret Josie on the right had in mind. Great. Back to square one. "Don't trust her, Daddy. I'm the real Josie." "This better be good," Joe heard himself whisper, sounding like a gang leader who had listened to excuses from new recruits. "When I was 4, I got really sick after you let me eat a whole carton of ice cream. You threw the box away before Mom got home and told her you didn't know what happened." Joe froze. He had no idea that she still remembered that. She was half her current age and out cold for the better part of 2 days. "That's nothing," the other Josie yelled, standing up to prove a point. "How about the time we went to the park and you started chatting to a friend and that man almost took me away?" Joe's jaw almost fell to the ground. How the hell could she remember that? She could barely walk when that happened. Both Josies were on the verge of crying. "That one doesn't matter. You once carried me on one arm and talked on the phone with the other. I saw an orange butterfly, went to grab it, and you dropped me on the kitchen floor." Joe clasped his hands over his ears. No. She did not remember that. How is that even possible? She was just a baby. Not even 5 months old. It was the very first time Joe had to take care of baby Josephine all by herself while Jane ran her errands. He was on the phone with his wife to remind her that they were out of rice. He'd even forgotten that the butterfly was orange, but he remembered it now. Clear as day. It was bright and pretty, and the baby squealed in delight as she reached out to grab it. "Yeah, honey, everything's fine." The baby fell head first on the cold tiles from a 5-foot height. "Joe, what the hell was that?" Jane's mechanical voice was nothing compared to his beating heart. The world was suddenly so loud and yet so still as he looked into the blank, empty eyes of his baby, lying on the kitchen floor. It felt like looking into plasticized cardboard, shiny and dead. But then she blinked once, then twice, then opened her mouth and wailed louder than a police siren. It was the first and last time he was happy to hear her cry. "Stop. No more. I don't want to hear more, all right?" He was breathing heavily. The girls exchanged looks again. They weren't afraid of each other anymore. It was worse. They were angry with each other. The look on their faces said murder, and it terrified Joe to no end. "It's okay, loves. I believe you. You don't have to fight. You're both Daddy's little girls. You're both my darlings, little Josie, and we'll be a very happy family. I'll talk to your mother and—" "No!" The Josie on the left trampled with her feet on the floor, something she always did when she didn't agree with her parents on something. "I'm the real one, Daddy," said Josie on the right from between quivering lips. That always happened when she was upset. She had it from her mother. Both of them were approaching him with tight fists and sunken eyebrows. "How about the time you hit the homeless old man and kept driving like nothing ever happened?" Joe started weeping. The other Josie pushed the one that just spoke to the side with her shoulder. "How about the time when you pushed Stephanie down the stairs and made her lose my older brother?" "Please, stop." Both occurrences happened before Josie was even born. He hit the homeless man on the way to the hospital. Jane was in labor with his princess. He had no other choice. Stephanie, though. He was desperate. He'd been married to Jane for a few months, and she was becoming dull and dry, and Joe wasn't used to the married life, and for God's sake, he slipped. It happens to every man. It wasn't out of love. It wasn't even out of need. It was just for the exhilaration of change, even if for 5 minutes. It wasn't his fault that the dumb bitch lied about taking the pill anyway. No, Josie. You were not allowed to tell your mother that. Something sparkled in both Josie's eyes. They threw each other a cautious glance and then looked at Daddy in slow motion. "If you don't choose me, I'll tell Mommy about Stephanie." Josie's room seemed to darken and close in on Joe in a promise of eternal suffocation. Joe fell to his knees. The other Josie spoke. "If you don't choose me, I'll tell Mommy, Grandma, Grandpa, and everybody from the office about spicy studies." The room was choking Joe. He couldn't breathe. How in the world could Josie know about spicy studies? That was supposed to be an even better sealed secret than him killing his unborn child and crippling his former mistress for life. Back in college, Joe's brilliant idea for easy money had been a porn site. As its name suggested, the protagonists had all been kids in his year or younger who, both with and without consent, needed spiked drinks before participating. Jane thought Joe finished college with flying colors, but Joe got expelled after just 3 semesters for ruining 43 young and promising lives. That number not including the members of the actors' families. Joe's head was in his hands. He was struggling to breathe. He wanted to turn deaf then and there to stop hearing all the dreadful truths his doubled little girl spilled out on him, like destructive fires of reckoning. He wanted her to stop. Involuntary images of him choosing one of them and choking the other to death popped into his head, and he knew. He knew that if he wanted to go through with it, he would have to hurry. His little Josephines had already opened Pandora's box. Hell, he did more than that. They were swimming in it and throwing its contents all over the place. But Joe's Pandora's box had a false base. And if Joe wanted to proceed with the murderous plot, he would need to hustle before one of them found it. And if you don't choose me, I'll tell everybody that it wasn't sudden, unexpected infant death when baby Auntie died. They discovered the fake bottom. It was over. Joe's biggest, darkest secret was not only one he kept from the world, but one he kept from himself. He looked up at the girls, his face wet with salty eye water, feeling infinitely inferior to the two all-knowing 8-year-olds. Joe wasn't a 39-year-old anymore. He was a 7-year-old boy watching the slow rise and fall of his sleeping baby sister's chest, wondering what would happen if he just put his teddy bear on her face for a couple of seconds. His mother called for him and the seconds turned to minutes. He didn't check the rise and fall of her chest again when he went back for the teddy, so when the doctor diagnosed her passing as a case of sudden, unexpected infant death, who was he to argue? Little Joe. Pathetic little Joe. Sorry little murderous Joe looked up at the two girls and was back to his guilty, bloody-handed 7-year-old self again. Julie? Is that you? Not one, but both Josies answered him by smiling and holding hands. Joe was less than human then. Girls, he wept. Julie, Josie, I don't understand what you want from me. Their voices were even and unrelenting. Choose. The hope of his future and the dread of his past were mirroring each other before him. He had to make a decision. But how could he? Ignorance only postpones doom, and regret is not enough to be forgiven. He couldn't choose. So Joe did the only thing he could do. He got up, turned around, and entered his nuptial bedroom. Jane was sleeping soundly, oblivious to the worlds colliding in her daughter's bedroom. Joe didn't even shoot her a final glance. He went straight for his ties drawer and picked one. It wasn't his favorite, but it didn't matter. The girls looked his way and followed him with their eyes as he entered the bathroom, always holding hands, never letting go of each other. Joe tied the tie neatly around his neck and knotted the other end around his toothbrush. He didn't know if it would hold, but he was dying to try. Literally. Joe grabbed Josie's plastic ladder for brushing teeth, placed it next to the open door, threw his tie on the other side, closed the door, and yanked the ladder from underneath his feet. The toothbrush held. Ironically enough, it held just enough for Joe to let out his dying breath. It snapped not even 10 seconds afterwards, and Joe's lifeless body fell to the bathroom tiles. The girls knew he was gone even before the toothbrush gave in. Still holding hands, they turned to Josie's bedroom and hid under the bed where they both belonged. Neither of them was the real Josie. The real Josie was sleeping in her parents' bed, hidden in the covers and her mother's arms, the place she always turned to when the monsters under her bed were upsetting her. But that wasn't Joe's concern anymore. Joe already made his choice.
Is that St. James or St. John? She thought. Megan continued to focus on the bare stone statue nearest to her, mounted on its pedestal along the church wall, facing the side of her pew. The church service had dragged on, and Megan felt herself beginning to nod off. They were both sons of Zebedee and Salome, but I could never tell one from the other, either from the statues or the paintings. A random thought came to her. No, not that Salome. The dim sunlight on the overcast day outside filtered through the stained glass windows of the church, where the burial service was being held. Megan sat in the far back pew behind her family, from which she could see Grandma Blint's black pillbox hat and a hint of its mesh veil peeking above the burnished mahogany pew closest to the altar. The priest stood close to Grandma Blint in the aisle between the rows of pews and had gone through the final recitation in the Book of Common Prayer, asking for a moment of silence to remember Grandpa Blint. The priest asked everyone to rise from their seats, and Megan was snapped out of her internal monologue, with her attention again on her grandfather's funeral proceedings. Megan straightened her skirt with her hands and stood with everyone else. The priest concluded,
"Forasmuch as it has pleased our Heavenly Father, in his wise providence, to take unto him our beloved brother, Walter Blint, we, therefore, commit his body to the ground, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, looking for the blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God through our Savior Jesus Christ, who shall change the body of our humiliation and fashion it anew in the likeness of his own body of glory, according to the working of his mighty power, wherein he is able even to subdue all things unto himself."
The gathering of friends and family members then replied, "Amen," as the priest put down his prayer book on the pulpit and signaled the elderly organist that the funeral service had ended. The breadth of the church's space was filled with the hymn being played, and the attendants began to file out into the center aisle from their seats to leave. Megan left her pew last and walked through the red ornate double doors of the church and down the shallow concrete steps, following her mother and father. "Where is Grandma? Is she still inside?" Megan's mother Claire turned around and searched through the front doors, standing at the edge of the carefully manicured lawn surrounding the church. Claire was a broad-shouldered, matronly woman, taking more after Grandpa Blint than her mother. Megan was considerably shorter in height, and really didn't resemble her family at all, either in her appearance or in her mannerisms. "I'll go check. I don't see Grandma behind us, so she must still be with Grandpa's casket." Megan smirked at Claire and began to walk back into the church to find her grandmother. The church itself was not particularly large, but had a Gothic cathedral style that included the statuary of angels and saints, placed prominently among the arches of its interior. 4 spires reached up into the cloudy afternoon sky that now showed signs of developing rain. 1 spire on either side of the facade of the church, and the other 2 atop its gray shingled roof. Megan saw Grandma Blint seated in the front left pew, her eyes locked onto her deceased husband's enclosed lacquered coffin. The casket was long and custom-made, as Grandpa Walter had been a tall man in life, in contrast to Grandma Abigail's petite stature. Megan walked to the pew and sat down next to Grandma. "I miss him so much. I can't stop thinking about him." Grandma took more tissue papers from her purse and dabbed her eyes with them. "I'm not sure how I can go on without your grandfather. He was truly my whole life after your mother and other children grew up and moved away." "Grandma, we all miss Grandpa Blint too. None of us expected this to be so sudden, but Grandpa is at peace now. A prolonged illness would have been much worse. Come on, let's join the family outside. Uncle Harvey is going to take Grandpa's coffin to the cemetery now. The hearse is waiting." Megan offered to help her grandmother up from her seat, but Grandma Abigail stood up by herself and slowly made her way out of the church, putting the tissues back into her purse. The 6 pallbearers came for the casket and took possession of their burden, bringing it out of the open exit door past the rows of pews on the right side of the church. St. Bartholomew's was at the intersection of a busy street in the town's downtown historical district. The church shared a few blocks with the small museum, a colonial-era boarding house, and the town hall. The town's main square was not far from the church, and was a gathering place for the students of the sole local college. Megan kept pace with her grandmother to the cars parked adjacent to the street curb, while a group of pedestrians gathered on the street corner opposite the church. Grandma Blint stopped to speak to her daughter, who had been waiting for her mother to emerge from the church. Megan continued to walk toward the street, as her car was parked on the curb furthest from the church and closest to the street crossing. Megan took the car keys out of her skirt pocket and glimpsed the busy street activity. She noticed an old man standing with his head down behind the walkers who were waiting for the signal light to change. He towered over the bunch, so he was visible even from behind them, but his posture was fatigued, and his shoulders slumped. The old man's wispy white hair was matted, forming a low crown around his otherwise bald head. As the flashing light turned to solid green and the throng of people moved forward, the old man, who was dressed in dark formal attire, remained standing at the corner, with his face obscured. When the people reached the sidewalk alongside the church, the man's stooped neck shot up, and he gazed directly at Megan. His face showed nothing but complete, utter terror. The man began gesturing and mouthing words that Megan couldn't decipher from her distance. His weathered face contorted itself, as if seized in some apoplectic fit. Megan then realized that the old man was Grandpa Blint, watching his distorted, painful attempts to communicate something, but with nothing produced that was perceptible. A group of cars drove in front of Grandpa Blint after the streetlight finished blinking amber, and he was gone after they passed. Megan stood silently in shock. That couldn't have been real, she thought. My grief must be much worse than I imagined. All the stress must be causing me to hallucinate. I couldn't have seen that. Megan pulled her thin-rimmed glasses off of her face and rubbed her eyes, breathing slowly and deliberately. She stood still, tried to regain her composure, and then resumed walking as if in a mild daze. Megan settled into the driver's seat of her car and looked into the rearview mirror, now apprehensive that another vision might come to her. She started the car engine and pulled out of the parking spot onto the side street that was parallel to the church. The funeral wake was being held at Uncle Harvey's house, which was an hour's drive from the church. Of all her adult children, Uncle Harvey lived the closest to Grandma Blint, but his house was still considerably removed from the childhood home that their mother still occupied to this day.
Are you alright, Megan? You look like you've seen a ghost, if you don't mind me saying.
Megan's father, Sean, met his daughter at the front door to Uncle Harvey's home and let her inside. The living room was full of the family's relatives, holding drinking glasses and talking among themselves. Megan's mother was seated at the kitchen table in the adjoining room with a group of older women, deep in conversation. Megan's father was younger than her mother, with a lithe build and a typically buoyant demeanor. The two had met during their college days and had started a family immediately afterward. Sean was a high school guidance counselor, and Claire was a science teacher at the same school. The three of them had traveled across the country to attend the funeral on very short notice, as Grandpa Blint had not even been hospitalized before he passed away. I just need to sit down, Is there somewhere on the sofa I can rest? Megan moved past Uncle Harvey and sat down next to some of her younger cousins, with paper plates of food on their laps. You'd better not spill any of that, Steve. Getting a beet stain out of this rug would be no picnic. Megan was attempting to change the subject and lose her father in the crowd. No, Megan. Come and sit with us in the kitchen. Grandma Blint moved toward her and stopped in front of her seated granddaughter. I want you to tell Aunt Stasia and Aunt Betty about your plans for college this fall. You worked so hard for that scholarship, and I want to let the whole family know what you have accomplished. Grandpa would have been so proud of you. Megan joined everyone in the kitchen and began explaining how she had won a full scholarship to study journalism at her mother's alma mater. I am a legacy, so that might have helped as well. But Mom didn't study photojournalism. Right, Mom? Claire looked around the guests at the table and said, No, I was an organic chemist, but then I became pregnant with you, followed by your brother. I've since been reduced to teaching an unending series of unruly freshmen the mole method. But you were worth it. Aunt Stasia interrupted and said, Claire was always so interested in Mother's farmers' almanacs and reference manuals on practical botany. All three sisters really loved reading, but your mother spent her 4 years at the Lyceum Academy with her nose buried in a book. We were quite surprised when your mother met Sean and got married. We didn't even think she liked boys at all. Aunt Stasia winked and then smiled at Claire. Claire grinned wryly and continued. Megan is enrolled for her first semester classes, but has yet to find a place to live. I insisted that she have no roommates during the first year of college to prevent any bad habits from forming. So, the dormitories are out of the question. Megan interjected, saying, What kind of bad habits? You know, I could have matriculated at Carlisle House, which is all girls. Not exactly a den of iniquity, Mom. Aunt Stasia turned her head away from Megan and looked at Claire, saying, More like a nunnery. Claire, you should really let Megan have some fun. College is not only about studying and building a future, it's about... Grandma Blint had been observing the conversation and then broke in. The dormitories are very low rent, Megan. I wouldn't want you to spend any time in those. You can stay with me instead while you look for a suitable off-campus apartment. You'll be safe, I promise. Grandma Blint now exuded a pleasant calmness, which was the first time Megan had seen her grandmother like this since the day before the funeral. Claire became very bright and said, Yes, that solves your problem, Megan. You can help sort Grandpa's things and clean up around the old townhouse. We'll send everything that you have packed for school. Grandma needs someone right now, and we have to be back home soon. Megan shifted uneasily in her chair, but smiled compliantly at her mother. Megan had been to her grandma's house only a few times, and never overnight. The 2-story townhome on the corner of its residential street was filled with books accumulated from Grandma Blint's years in Latin and herbology studies. Megan could recall the musty smell from the leather-bound text that permeated the second-floor pantry, overpowering everything else. Come up! I want to show you what's in the trunk, Grandma Blint called down the short ladder leading up into the attic of the townhome. Megan had just finished moving her suitcase into the spare bedroom down the hallway from Grandma's room, and had stepped out to face the collapsible wooden steps. I'll be up in a minute. I need to see your bathroom first. Megan headed toward the single lavatory, but passed it instead. The upstairs kitchen and its pantry was the final room at the end of the hallway and held Grandma Blint's small personal library. Megan opened the shuttered doors behind the kitchen table and observed the shelves of cookbooks and reference tomes. She stooped down to the lowest shelf and ran her finger over the titles of botany tracts about mistletoe, books on preparing animals, such as sheep for supper and an illustrated lunar calendar. Megan paused at a work that seemed particularly aged, with a golden sickle on the spine. The sickle appeared to have been inked with real gold metal. "Are you coming up or not? I want to show you a few keepsakes before dinner." Megan rose up and replied, "Be there in a minute. I have to wash my hands and then I'll be done." Megan started the climb up the steps, which required a firm grasp of the rails holding the steps together. The ladder to the attic was very flimsy and would have difficulty supporting any significant weight. "Grandpa had to crouch down every time he came up here to put something away. He couldn't even use the ladder except to pull himself up into the attic. He didn't come up here that much, as it was a chore to do so." Megan stuck her head through the opening in the attic floor and saw it had a low ceiling, with a semicircular Diocletian window, offering a view of the sidewalk outside the house. She finished her ascent and was able to stand upright next to Grandma Blint, who was engrossed in digging through an open storage chest. "Here it is. I haven't opened this scrapbook in such a long time. Your mother rarely came to visit, you know. We would always have to travel when we wanted to see them, which wasn't that often." Grandma held a yellowed page from a journal in front of Megan for her to view. "Your grandfather and I were voted homecoming king and queen at the Lyceum Academy our senior year. This is us in the chatterbox section of the Oakwood Observer. Your grandfather was so handsome when we were teenagers." Megan had never seen Grandma Blint as a girl, and was startled by how little she had changed over the years. Grandpa Blint had truly exhibited his age, and would have been almost unrecognizable from the confident, vital man standing next to the youthful Abigail, holding the homecoming prize in the newspaper picture. "This same issue announced my second-place win in the Classics League National Essay Writing Contest. My first year of Latin studies was entirely paid for by my prize money. I came right back to Lyceum Academy after university and instructed classes in Latin. My firstborn, Harvey, put my teaching career on hold for a while, as did his siblings." Megan took Grandma Blint's hand away from the page and began to flip through the entries in the scrapbook. "Where is the article on the Classics League contest? What did you write about in Latin?" "My mother never clipped it. She thought that studying the classics was a waste of time. But I was encouraged by Father. Most of my academic interests were due to his influence. I remember the write-up appearing several pages over from our homecoming photo, near the back of the same section. Perhaps you can put your investigative reporter cap on and find it for me." Grandma Blint glanced over at Megan and raised her eyebrows slightly, with a hopeful expression. Megan closed the scrapbook and passed it to Grandma Blint. "Where would I find a decades-old news story? Is the Oakwood Observer even being published anymore? I would imagine it is not." "Why, yes, it is, but at weekly intervals, as it has been since the newspaper began printing. It shouldn't be too hard to find the archived copy at the library downtown, as there aren't that many editions to comb through. I haven't been there since I retired, but the whole newspaper catalogue should be tucked away in a back room somewhere. I would be quite pleased to see it after all these years. Oh, and to answer your question, I wrote my essay on the Roman legion. The Romans were victorious in battle because they were able to overcome their fear of death and fight as one, while their enemies couldn't summon the same fortitude or precision. Vincit qui se vincit. Do you have any old photos of my mom? She was such a bookworm. I bet they're hilarious. Well, I have a few of her from high school. Claire was so awkward and shy that she didn't even feel comfortable being photographed. Her graduation yearbook is in one of these binders. What's this? Megan noticed an oak wood cane with a silver metal handle in the shape of a ram's head with horns. The The cane was leaning against the paneling, along the wall behind the trap door to the floor below. "Your grandfather had a slight limp the last few years. That cane belonged to my father, who brought it over from Wiltshire with us when we emigrated, right before my sophomore year of high school. After he passed away, I kept it as an heirloom of sorts." The summer night's waxing gibbous moon provided a soft light in Megan's bedroom as she lay half asleep. Her mind was occupied with the events of the past few days and what was to come. Tomorrow morning would bring some apartment hunting and then a trip to the library to uncover Grandma's lost scholastic prize write-up. "This bed isn't stable," Megan murmured. "A lumpy mattress and a rickety brass bed frame." Megan rolled over and stood at the foot of the bed, stepping over to the open window with a view of the street. She paused and scanned the outside, but saw nothing other than the next row of houses that continued after the intersection dividing the 2 blocks. "I have to get some sleep. I don't want to use sleeping pills." Megan returned to bed with a loud squeak and began to drift off into slumber again. The house was entirely still. Then, somewhere down the hallway, Megan heard distant movement, the familiar creaking of the attic's wooden ladder buckling under a weight, and the sound of something heavy being lowered onto the floor from above. Then she heard one leaden footstep, and then what sounded like a cane tapping the floor. Another step, and the cane again hitting the hallway floor of the silent house. One after the other, and getting closer to the door of Megan's bedroom. Deliberate steps down the hall, past Grandmother's room, past the bathroom, and then ending in front of Megan's bedroom door. The loosely fitted doorknob to the bedroom rattled violently. Whoever was trying to enter the room was intent on getting in despite the lock. The vehement turning of the doorknob continued for a few more moments, and then stopped abruptly. A terror-stricken Megan continued to lie on her bed, fixated on the now quiescent bronze knob. Nothing further was heard from the other side of the bedroom door, and Megan fell into sleep without even realizing it. "I think someone was in the house last night." Megan took her chair at the kitchen table, while Grandma Blint placed breakfast before her. "Someone? You mean a burglar?" Grandma Blint didn't take her seat, and looked right at Megan. "Yeah, how could you sleep through all that noise?" "I always sleep very soundly. I grow my own plants for special herbal teas. I have a nice cup of medicated tea before bedtime, and it relaxes me. I could sleep through anything. But what happened? Did you notice if anything was taken this morning?" "Nothing seems missing, but I haven't been downstairs yet. I think there was someone outside my room, but it was very late, and I might have been dreaming. I would close the windows tonight just in case, even though we are on the 2nd floor." Grandma Blint sat across from Megan with a worried demeanor. "I think it was just a dream, dear. But I will latch the windows this evening before we retire. We may get a chill as the harvest season is approaching, so I will close the upstairs windows, irrespective of nighttime intruders." Grandma Blint produced a faint smile, and Megan munched on her buttered toast, pausing to speak. "You mean the fall equinox? I remember that from high school astronomy class. There is a fall equinox in September, and a spring equinox in March. The equinoxes and the phases of the moon are part of the lunar calendar." "You are correct, my girl. The harvest moon is the full moon that is closest to the autumnal equinox. It is blood red in color. Et luna in sanguinem." Megan wiped her lips with a napkin and left it on her plate. I have to go and do some apartment hunting. I'll be back by dinner. Have to run or I won't get anything done today.
Will you find my news story? Swing by the library if you get a chance.
Sure, Grandma Abigail. I'll be back soon. Megan's curiosity had gotten the better of her, and she decided to take the bus to the library first, instead of browsing through the listings for a studio apartment. Her scholastic course load wouldn't begin for a few weeks, and Megan assured herself that there was plenty of time to find somewhere to live. Exploring the library was too much of a temptation to resist. A long set of stairs with metal handrails led up to the public library's edifice. The red-brown brick building was rectangular in shape and had a spacious reception desk at which a young woman was engaged in some paperwork. The worn maple wooden floors echoed Megan's footsteps as she entered the library and made her way to the librarian on duty. "Hello, I would like to read some back issues of the Oakwood Observer. Are they in the stacks, or do I have to request them?" The librarian put down her pencil and answered Megan.
"They are on microfiche, if it is older issues that you need. What year are we talking about?"
"What is microfiche?" The librarian continued to lean on the reception desk as she spoke. Her black hair was tied into a tight bun behind her head, projecting an overall appearance of neatness and efficiency.
"I hadn't heard of microfiche either until I started working at the library. The microfiche machine barely gets touched as patrons don't research the Oakwood Observer's archives. Romance novels and magazines are generally what people borrow. The library stopped adding new editions to microfiche almost 20 years ago. The last 2 decades of editions are stored digitally on CDs that you can check out but not remove from the library." "No, the news articles I'm looking for go back many years. I require the entire back catalog if I can get it." "That shouldn't be a problem. If you've never seen microfiche before, it is stored in small plastic canisters. The images are compressed on something similar to a roll of film negatives. I'll show you. Please wait while I locate the box for the Observer."
The librarian seated Megan on the chair in front of a battered Micron microfiche reader. The gray metal and plastic device occupied a single table among the book stacks at the back of the library. The librarian opened the first microfiche container and mounted the roll in the machine's spools.
"This is how you can view each edition,"
she said, turning the plastic control piece to move from each image to the next.
"Some pages might be smudged or upside down, but use the knob below the frame to adjust the focus or rotate the image. Each canister in the box is labeled by year. These Observer newspapers are fragments from the town's history that are seldom discussed. You are a rare bird indeed. But I will leave you to your work. Just let me know if you need anything else."
"Thanks, I'll do that." Megan found the container dated with the year of the homecoming article that Grandma Blint had shown her in the attic, and fed its roll through the spools. The viewing frame was lit up with black and white photos, and Megan zoomed through the front pages until she found the issue's chatterbox section. At the back of the section was a small article with a write-up on the Classics League, and Grandma Blint's runner-up status. Megan took a snapshot with the microfiche reader screen's copy feature and printed the page to the copier closest to the reception desk. The librarian saw Megan advancing on the copier and spoke to her.
"Did you find anything exciting?"
Megan took the copied page from the tray and replied, "No, it's pretty mundane. A family member wanted something from the good old days. Nothing spectacular." The librarian continued to speak to Megan.
"There are some stories back far enough that makes one wonder about the town. I've read through the very old issues of the Observer, and you might be surprised at some of the things in there."
"Really? I have some time. I guess I could do some further reading into the Observer's annals."
"Be my guest. We don't close for hours, so you can soak up some of the town lore."
Megan returned to the microfiche reader and read past the end of the school year issue into the subsequent months. The September issue had a story on a roof collapse at the Lyceum Academy, killing the Latin teacher and the assistant principal. The school blamed the tragedy on poor construction. Megan began reading the next year's news when she noticed the librarian standing behind her.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just that you might be the only other person who has read these newspaper articles recently. The library is often almost empty, so I come back here and read the Observer's bygone issues. I see you found the story about the Lyceum Academy. That is where the pattern begins.
What pattern? A tragedy like that repeated itself?
More than repeated itself. There were 2 deaths, 2 disappearances, or a death and a disappearance in Oakwood every 8 years after the Lyceum Academy classroom roof caved in. Always in the month of September. It is the strangest thing I have ever seen. Let me show you something.
The librarian opened another microfiche container and added it to the viewer's spools. She quickly turned the knob and arrived at a bold headline above a picture of 2 elderly women.
In September, there was a house fire that claimed 2 sisters who lived together. The police and the insurance company found that it was due to faulty wiring. After that, there was a car crash that killed a young married couple. 2 children vanished in the park at the edge of town, and there were several times in which 2 unrelated strangers went missing or died in September, but otherwise had no connection to each other. I can show you the rest of the articles if you want to read more.
No, that is fine. I believe you. But a few deaths every 8 years aren't really a pattern. I would chalk that up to coincidence. People die all the time, even in accidents. But it would make a good horror story. Megan presented Grandma Blint with the photocopy of the Oakwood Observer page that evening, and Grandma put the paper into her scrapbook. All the windows were shut in the townhouse as Megan prepared for bed. I need some air. I'll open the window for a while and then get some rest, Megan thought. I hope I don't pass out before I remember to close it. Megan undid the latch and pushed the lower half of the window up, and then locked the latch at the top. The full moon shone down on Megan as she paused to inhale from the nighttime atmosphere. She crawled into bed, and then heard the attic ladder lower itself outside her room. The house was quiet, as it had been the previous evening, and Grandma Blint had closed the door to her bedroom over an hour ago. Megan hoped that Grandma had somehow made it out of her room, without a sound, and was now coming back from the attic. Heavy steps, accompanied by the sound of a cane striking the hallway floor, made themselves known to Megan. The mystery visitor from the night before had returned. The cadence of footsteps and a walking cane continued, and then ended at the threshold of her bedroom door. An unseen presence gripped the doorknob and shook it with great strength. Megan was sure this was not a nightmare this time around. As before, the doorknob was twisted from the outside for several more moments, and then became noiseless, as if it had never been disturbed. Megan's first impulse was to throw open the door and confront her stalker. She was so seized with fear that she was no longer afraid, and instead had become emboldened. Megan opened the lock to the door and stepped out into the hallway. Grandma Blint was facing her, holding a cup of tea in a saucer.
Let's go to the kitchen, my dear. I'll explain everything.
Megan was wide-eyed and breathing hard, but followed her grandmother to the table.
Here, drink this. You'll feel better.
Megan was speechless, but did as she was told. The tea was warm and possessed a bitter but sweet taste, soothing Megan's throat as it went down. "Did you see him? Where did he go?" Megan asked.
Grandpa? Well, he's around here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where.
Grandpa Blint?
Grandma Abigail, please, you're scaring me.
Megan sat down at the kitchen table and drank the rest of her tea. Your grandfather's spirit can remain on this plane as long as the second sacrifice hasn't been completed. Once the second death is completed, you will both be sent to oblivion. The horned god will be satiated then. Megan felt languid, and then a numbing sensation began to spread from her legs into the remainder of her body. Grandma Blint's relaxed tone changed, and her voice became malevolent. She leaned into Megan and said, Grandpa wasn't trying to get into your room to harm you, Megan. He was trying to enter your room to warn you. You've poisoned me. Yes. I will dispose of your body and say that you left to start your classes. When you fail to show up, you will be listed as a missing person. Non corpus delicti. I'm so much older now that I can't get around the way I used to. I have to find other ways to complete the cycle, with those closer to me. Megan slowly slid down the kitchen chair onto the floor, feeling almost completely numb and unable to remain seated. As she was beginning to lose all feeling and vision, Megan could sense a rope being placed around her neck, by which she was dragged toward the bathroom. Grandma Blint was surprisingly spry, with a powerful, pulling vigor. When Julius Caesar and his armies first encountered the native Celts on what is now the British Isles, he wrote that these men believed that their gods delighted in the slaughter of prisoners and criminals. But when these captives were in short supply, they sacrificed even the innocent. I'm going to cut your throat in the bathtub, my dear. It will be quick.
She Has His Eyes by Charles Davenport. Performed by Marshall Ragsdale and featuring Michelle Ragsdale. Abigail was annoyed with her mother.
I'm just saying it's something to consider.
Testing? The newly minted Abigail Creelman applied the powder to baby Laurie's peach-pink butt. Rose had more than 42 years' experience in navigating her eldest daughter's moods.
But no one wants to think it can happen, but babies fuss. You don't notice a diaper needs changing, they fuss. You miss giving them a meal of strained peas, they fuss. The wind changes direction, they fuss.
They fall down the stairs, they fuss?
Abigail looked at her mother with a gunslinger's squint as she secured the huggies around her newborn's waist.
Oh, you'll never let me forget that. You took a little tumble down some stairs. You seem to have turned out all right. A little disrespectful, but otherwise fine.
It was 2 floors, Ma. Dad told me.
Your father, God rest his soul, was a liar. Always was. The whole Gish side of the family is known for it. Corner office, he said. That's how he got me to say yes in the first place.
Nice, Ma.
Abigail gently took baby Laurie to her crib, the mobile having been placed for maximum stimulation of baby Laurie's visual senses, drifted lazily in slow counterclockwise motions, cycling an inchworm, a seahorse, and a monkey past this conversation, all seeming to say to Abigail, "What? This again? I know she's your mother, but for God's sake."
Puddin', I'm just worried. She's adorable, of course, but she just lays there, happy as a clam, not a peep out of her, and she just had a hefty sackful back there. I just don't want you to be sideswiped by this.
Her mother waited for a response. The woman then, without pause for reflection, asked if her little puddin', a nickname her mother had given her in 4th grade just when Abigail's self-esteem was at its most vulnerable, actually intended to keep her baby upon hearing that her daughter and Eddie were expecting. Rose had been concerned about her daughter's impossibly high standards, and how they were likely to drive her to spinsterhood, and had signed off on the idea of her only daughter ever giving her a grandchild once she'd passed her 32nd year. Her mother had an unhealthy obsession with all things related to aging and what could go wrong the longer you lived. Rose had her 3rd and last child 2 days after her 28th birthday.
Mom, rest assured, many healthy women have healthy babies well into their 40s.
I know, Abby, but that Garcia woman did a report on it for Channel 4.
Thank you, NBC.
She interviewed that pediatrician they have on the Sunday show sometimes. Dr. Mitch, he said after 35, the risk of preterm labor increases by 20% or so. Preemies can get lung problems, digestive problems, brain bleeds, and neurological complications, including, retardation.
Abigail's mother was very concerned that Laurie might have some form of developmental delay. Those were not the words she used, however. The words had been,
Abby, you have to be prepared if the baby is,
The word had not been special, or even slow, but
retarded. And might have to be, oh God forbid, put in a home somewhere.
a home. As if her mother was some Dickensian character, or a woman that had grown up with memories of the Great Depression rather than Creedence Clearwater Revival.
I was early by less than a week, Mom. I saw the report. In fact, you emailed me the link to the website. A healthy 40-year-old with no medical issues, in good physical shape, and who conceived naturally, is likely to have just as normal a pregnancy as a woman in her 30s. That's what her pediatrician told me.
Oh, of course she'd say that.
Her mother's hand waved, dismissing a doctor that was obviously just trying to drum up business. Rose was decidedly of the opinion that women should not be police officers, pilots, soldiers, or doctors. The hormones,
Dr. Mitch also said that after 40, that the risk of having a child with issues increases. And not by a little bit, my dear. By 30% for mothers and 50% for fathers.
Edward was in his latish 40s, almost to his 50s, but Abigail was not sure exactly when that would happen. She'd asked, of course, written down his birthday and everything, when they had first started getting serious, but she always lost the note somehow, and couldn't seem to remember it when called upon to do so. The number of times she'd had to inquire before would make broaching the subject again awkward at best. She also did not know such minor details as his shoe size and blood type.
Mom! I don't know why you have to make everything so difficult. Would I have done it this way if she'd been planned? Of course not. I know the risks involved.
Abigail turned away from her mother, putting the powder and the diapers away in that little French-style cabinet that Eddie had insisted she get.
The fact is that Laurie is crawling, and just as smooth as can be.
So?
Oh, Dr. Mitch not mentioned that? Your granddaughter is barely 2 months old, and already she's getting out of that jerky phase where babies look like someone having a stroke.
That comment is in poor taste, Puddin'. You know your Aunt Ethel had a stroke.
Great Aunt Ethel? She died when I was 11.
She was still very fond of you.
Abigail had been a bit afraid when she'd first learned about her pregnancy. Not with the dogged and almost enthusiastic zeal her mother displayed, but worried still. She remembered the way her foot had tapped vigorously against the tiles of the pediatrician's office.
She's following you with her eyes when you move.
The young woman had displayed a confidence that bordered on aggressiveness.
She does that with everybody. She's looking at you right now. Well, the fact that she's moving her head so easily is amazing in and of itself. But she knows the difference between you and others, which is also kind of incredible. Watch.
The doctor had got up and walked out of the room, closing the door behind her. Abigail looked around, unsure of what was to happen next, and she felt Laurie moving in her arms. She looked down and saw her baby staring up at her, with a look that she would later think seemed questioning. She'd smiled down into those curious little eyes and brushed her daughter's straight locks away from her face.
I don't have any answers, kiddo.
Dr. Mathery walked back into the exam room, and baby Laurie's head snapped away from her mother's face and her tiny little gaze fixed on her doctor. Mathery smiled slightly and moved to her left. Laurie's eyes followed her. Mathery took a quick step to her right, and the baby's gaze went along with her.
You see? The muscle coordination she's showing is pretty rare. It'd be a good sign if she was holding up her own head at this stage, but she's moving it around, tracking things as they come into her view. And then there's this.
Dr. Mathery had held out her arms for Abigail to give her the baby. Abigail was uncertain, and that had clearly shown on her face.
Mrs. Creelman, I'm her pediatrician, and since this is my office, I am unlikely to run out the front door with her.
Abigail smiled, but was still hesitant. Slowly she'd extended her arms towards the doctor, and felt the weight of her child being taken from her.
Now, walk out the door, count to 15, and come back in and look your daughter in the eye.
What if she's looking at you?
I don't think that'll be the case, but if it is, don't try and get her attention. Just stand there and wait for her to find you.
Abigail had backed out of the room, wary for reasons she could not bring to the front of her brain. She stood out in the hallway and counted, her eyes not leaving the closed door directly in front of her. There was an elderly woman in a wheelchair that Abigail saw only out of peripheral vision. Her labored breathing provided a counterpoint to Abigail's quickening heartbeat. At the other end, a tray carried by an orderly clanged to the floor, spilling multicolored pills across the tiles and pulling her focus away for just a moment. When she looked back to the door, Abigail was certain that Dr. Mathery and Laurie would be gone. The whole thing a plot to take her baby and run off to God knows where in the world. Perhaps more alarming the cocktail of emotion that coursed through her, above the panic at the thought, over the embarrassment at being so ridiculous, was the small thread of relief that she felt. Some part of her saw this as a way to be free, and it was not a part she particularly liked having. She walked back into the exam room and found Dr. Mathery still in it, and the baby still in her lap. Laurie let out a short sound that was something between a gasp of recognition and a laugh. Her arm extended slightly in the direction of her mother.
We would normally see that kind of parental recognition at 3 months. A big, spurt, may be the best word for it, happens in children's brains around that time. They become more attuned to the outside world and more sensitive to changes in it. Always kind of amazing to see, but I don't think I've ever seen a baby this far along, this early.
There's no way she's challenged in some way, is there?
Mrs. Creelman, I've been doing this work for a very long time now.
To Abigail's eye, Mathery looked all of 28 at the oldest. How she could have been doing anything a very long time was a mystery to the new mother.
And I do not see this lightly. I find nothing wrong with your daughter. Quite the reverse, actually. She's quite ahead of the curve.
Ahead of the curve. What does that even mean?
Rose had not been swayed by the story.
What do you mean, what does it mean? She's perceptive, coordinated, and gifted. Ahead of her class.
Somewhere close to the top, Abigail Creelman's eldest daughter had her mad stampede halted, as it was most days, by the lip of the second-to-last step. They'd just been in this house for a few months, but even at their old home, which had been a ranch with only 3 steps going up to the front door, Kathy had managed 9 times out of 10 to bang her shin or almost knock out her front teeth by snagging her toe on one step or another. Rose didn't think that Abby's oldest child was any more stupid or clumsy than the average 12-year-old. It was, and she would never know this about herself in a conscious way, that she wanted the child to show some shame about it. Instead, her granddaughter that had more than a fair bit of Gish, that famous clan of liars, in her, and way too much of Abby's first husband, came in bounding into the room looking very at ease with herself, her curly red hair bouncing around her with a wide smile across her face that showed no sign whatsoever of embarrassment.
Fall up the stairs again, klutz?
No.
Unable to hold the face for long, Kathy broke into a laugh. Rose had wanted to be a dancer at some point in her youth, and after a few Midori sours, she'd told more than a few bartenders across resorts up and down the Mexican coast that very thing. She would tell these men, that she would refer to as a Jose, regardless of the number of times they might correct her, that they should be very careful with their youth, because once they had a child, it was over. Abigail, in her own way, had been moderately gifted with strength, a certain kind of strong-featured beauty, and an easy intellectual charm. She also possessed her father's athleticism. George Gish had been battering Ram on the football field, but that was due to pure muscle and speed, rather than any finesse. His daughter would tear down the soccer pitch in ways that made the old man proud, right up until his passing. What she had never possessed was grace. She was a clomper, a thudder, and prone to injury. For that, and precious little else, Rose sort of resented her daughter. There was little of her in Abby, and even less in her oldest grandchild. She was very aware that after she passed away, there wouldn't be much left of Rose Gish in this world at all.
Go wash up. Eddie will be home soon.
Okay, Mom.
Kathy said at an unnecessary volume. She seemed to notice that her grandmother was there for the first time, and shouted a greeting at her before she lurched forward towards the bathroom, managing to just miss clipping her head on the door jamb.
That girl stumbles around like a sailor on shore leave.
Ma, knock it off for 2 seconds.
Oh, Puddin', you were the same. There wasn't a single table edge in our whole house that you hadn't whacked with the side of your face by the time you were 6. Another thing you get from your father.
So?
The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Kathy is your spitting image. She moves like you, looks like you, and you favor your father's side. The Gishes have strong genes. Look at any photo album in the house, and every single Gish, or anyone with any Gish in them, has that same jawline, that wide nose, and those hazel eyes. They were your father's best feature, if you ask me.
I don't...
Oh, have you looked at your baby's eyes?
Mom, what are the chances I haven't looked at my own daughter's eyes?
Well, then you tell me. What would you call that color?
Abigail did not look towards the crib, nor did she turn to face her mother. Instead, she stared at the middle distance, taking in only the mobile, with its vast menagerie of creatures as they orbited through the dust motes evident in the late afternoon sunlight. Where did we get that? She wondered to herself, and then found she could not remember.
Does anyone in Eddie's family have eyes like that?
Abigail looked down then at her daughter, and could see her daughter inching closer to sleep with each slow blink. What would you call that color? Amber? Gold? Would you even call someone's eyes gold? Were they hazel like her own? Wait. Did they look blue just then? Before she could decide, Laurie's eyes closed tightly, and she began to snore ever so slightly.
Well, of course they do.
Who? His mother? Is she also the one where Laurie gets her sweet disposition? Was his dad's side all early walkers? Because I swear that child is going to be up on 2 feet before you know it.
Eddie doesn't talk to his parents anymore. That's why they weren't at the wedding.
Why was that again? Why is it that they don't speak anymore?
He doesn't like to talk about it.
You know, Abby, since you two have been together, that man has been at my house, or your Uncle Mike's, about 12 times or so. 4th of July, Christmas Eve, birthdays. Always brings a very nice gift. Mingles and makes very nice conversation. Everyone seems to like him, but no one knows anything about him.
Eddie doesn't talk about himself much. Abby felt an awkward sensation in her stomach, and hoped that she wasn't starting to come down with the flu.
See, that's the thing. Mike talked to him for nearly an hour last New Year's. They talked politics, religion, and even money. All the big ones you're supposed to avoid.
Eddie doesn't
like to talk about politics, I'm sure. Or religion, and he almost never talks about how much he makes. Still, he and Mike talked about those very topics. You know your uncle. He always wants to chew someone's ear off about what the senator's stance is on this issue, or why we should have prayer in schools again, but nobody bites because he turns into a real bore. So he was really happy to talk to Eddie that night, and even happier that you'd settle down with a man that had his head screwed on right.
So? Abby massaged her lower back. Suddenly she could feel all of those hours rocking little Lori to sleep.
You lean pretty far to the left, my dear, as has every man you've ever been with, up to and including Owen.
Rose cocked her eyebrows slightly as she intoned the name of Kathy's father, a man that had never gotten around to popping the question because he simply didn't believe in the institution of marriage. Uncle Mike had frequently and often in front of him stated how convenient for Owen he found that particular stance was. To be fair, Abby hadn't been a big believer in marriage until she'd meet Eddie Creelman.
Eddie and I don't have to agree on everything.
Her eyes began to throb, and she knew a migraine was on its way. As the first pike of pain began to pierce her left eye, she hoped she'd asked Eddie to pick up some ibuprofen on the way home.
I'm willing to bet it's never come up, and that's very unlike you, Puddin'. Remember that fight we had because I thought people should be allowed to use plastic bags if they wanted to? You don't keep those things to yourself, ever. So I asked Mike what they'd talked about specifically. More accurately, I asked him what was it that Eddie had said that Mike approved of so strongly.
Mom, I have to get dinner out of the oven.
You know, he couldn't tell me. Just got his weird, dreamy expression on his face for a few seconds, and then admitted that he just plumb couldn't recall. Oh, your Aunt Gretchen loved him. Talked his ear off at Jenny's christening, but she couldn't even tell me what they talked about. And 2 things I know about Gretchen is that she doesn't like anybody she hasn't known for 15 years or more, and hasn't forgotten grocery lists from shopping she did back in 1986. That woman remembers everything.
Mom, what are you getting at?
Who says I'm getting at anything? How did you 2 meet?
What?
I know you've told me before, but I can't seem to remember. So tell me again.
They'd met in the city near her work, of course. She'd been mad at Owen that day. They'd still been together then. Something about the water bill, or some such thing. She'd gone to treat herself to a coffee at that place she liked. And then she'd met Eddie. She'd met Eddie in line while she waited for her latte. Or had it been on the way back to work? Wait. Had she gone out for a drink that night? And had she run into him then? And there it was again. That blank spot where some detail about Eddie should be, but instead was just an empty space in her mind. Abigail knew that he'd be home by 7:30 or 8 at the latest, depending on the traffic on the 5. He'd sit at the dining room table and sort bills and mail for a bit, 15 minutes or so, no more. Then he'd watch TV. Nothing in particular, he had no favorite shows that she could think of. Well, he poked around on the internet for a bit, and then he'd stretch before going to bed. The next morning, he'd be out and on his way to work before the clock struck 6:30. All this she knew, but they were all facts, events. Details of a sort, sure, but she had no idea what Eddie's favorite movie was, or if he'd had any pets as a child. She knew they must have discussed these kinds of things at some point, even if it was in the idle getting-to-know-you stages of dating. But as she reached back, she found nothing to latch onto other than a building pressure in temples.
Abby? Are you listening to me?
Mom, I just don't want to talk about this anymore.
There is something wrong with Laurie and something wrong with Eddie. I'm not saying it to hurt you, and I wish to God it wasn't true. And I can't put my finger on what it is.
That's just it, Mom. You can't because there isn't anything. I'm happy. Eddie makes me happy. And Laurie makes me happy.
Listen, Puddin'.
Don't call me that. I hate it. I always have.
While it was true, even Abby was taken aback by the fierceness of her anger. Other words followed then, angry and spent in a rush. At some point, the baby shifted slightly, threatening to wake, and Abby demanded that her mother leave. Eddie came home sometime after that. Abby heard the front door open and Kathy rushing down the stairs to greet her stepfather, with a loud greeting proceeding in front of her. Kathy had liked Eddie right away, hadn't she? Abby wondered to herself. She'd always loved her daddy, but Eddie seemed to have effortlessly supplanted himself in the day-to-day role of father. The pain that had subsided since her mom had left flared briefly at these thoughts, and she had to lean against the upstairs wall a moment before she headed down to greet her husband. She woke in the middle of the night, both her husband and baby sleeping, Eddie next to her, and Laurie in her crib, both gently sawed logs in near perfect synchronicity with each other.
What did we have for dinner?
Abby said out loud to no one, and felt a tinge of discomfort fire off somewhere in her body.
What did we talk about?
Abby was suddenly and fully awake. She looked down at her husband's sleeping form, and tried to drink in every detail of his features, absently rubbing her temples as she did so. With determination, she shut her eyes and tried to summon a single detail. Hellfire ragged behind her eyes, and her gut threatened to dislodge itself with enormous force. Gripping at her midsection, she staggered over to the crib and repeated this new ritual down at dear, sweet little Laurie. She received the same results, and found herself in a heap at the front of the crib. In her mind, the competing desires to cry out and give voice to this fresh agony fought with the very real concern of waking her children. She groaned helplessly against the floor. The pain allowed no room for a rational thought to be held in her head, and did not fade quickly, so Abby lay there quite a while, her fingers gripping at the rug as though to gain some purchase and pull herself free. She rolled onto her side and tried to crawl back towards the bed. In her efforts, she heard Eddie stir, the bed creaking slightly as he sat up at the waist.
Abby?
As soon as Abby heard him, the pain that had been crushing downward and pinning her to the floor rolled off of her. It left with the ease of a well-loved jacket being shrugged off her shoulders.
Babe?
She said, now on her knees by the side of the bed.
You'll wake up the baby.
Propping himself up on one elbow, he turned to her with something that looked like perplexion, creasing his very pleasant face.
What are you doing down there? Did you have that nightmare again?
I don't...
Abby started to say, but realized that she had no idea of why she was on the floor of her bedroom.
What nightmare? What is he talking about?
Yes, you do. You know, the one about you falling off the cliff.
Yes.
Abby now clearly remembered her recurring dream of falling. She remained on the floor. The desire to move did not occur to her, and Eddie hadn't offered to help her up.
You've been having it for a few months now. I'm getting worried. I wish you'd see a doctor.
She hated to worry Eddie, and this going on even for a couple months was too long.
What's a few months, Abigail? Tell me, when is the first time you can remember having this dream he's talking about?
The voice in her head sounded quite a bit like her mother's. She felt a brief flare of pain. Maybe he was right, and she should make an appointment. Maybe get a referral for a sleep specialist.
You keep saying it's nothing, though. Waste of money to go to a doctor, you say.
It is nothing, sweetie. I don't need to see anyone.
Abby felt her ears and mouth begin to fill with a prickly, warm sensation. It was wonderful and relaxing, like being on your second glass of wine while sitting in a tub that was just the right temperature.
If you say so, boss lady.
Eddie teased. He scooted to her side of the bed and held out his hand to her.
You going to get back into bed or just stay there the whole night?
Of course she was going to get back into bed. It would make no sense to stay on the floor. Eddie had such funny ideas. In the dim light thrown off by Laurie's nightlight, she could just make out the valley of his palm on that outstretched hand. She traced the contours of it and saw there were no natural lines etched into the skin. It bunched and cured, but there was no detail to it. She felt a momentary revulsion, and she stared up at this man that she shared this bed with. The man she'd married.
He is not Abby. Tell me you can see it. He is nothing, doing an impression of a man.
Honey, everything's okay, right?
There was some emotion in his voice that Abby couldn't place.
Of course, honey. Everything's alright.
She took his hand, his smooth, lineless hand, and slid back between the sheets next to him. Before long, Eddie was muttering, seemingly already sliding back into sleep, falling into perfect sync with the baby's own soft cooing. Abby found no such rest as a single question rolled across her mind.
How did we meet? How did we meet? How did we meet? How did we meet? How did we meet?
As the morning light slid in between the blinds of the bedroom, signaling that another day was beginning to stir, Abby Creelman was aware only of two things. The blood that had begun streaming down her face at some point in the night had dried to a painful coating over her upper lip, and that there were two pairs of eyes observing her.
Duérmete, niño. Duérmete ya. Que viene el coco y te comiera. When Arthur was a little boy, his abuelita would tell him stories to keep him good and Catholic. Brush your teeth. Eat your vegetables. Don't hold that girl's hand, else a creature with sharp teeth and long claws would come and get you at night when Mom and Pop were asleep in bed. For him, growing up in the deserts of Arizona, it was called El Coco. All his friends had different names for them. The Kukui, the Boogeyman, Baba Yaga, Krampus, and of course old hat Lucifer himself. But he remembers meeting one kid, quiet a lot of the time, a transfer. He called it something else. He called it the Visitor. He remembers hearing him say it, the way it made the air in the room stale and stiff, like walking through molasses, the way it rolled out of his mouth and hit the floor in that empty gymnasium. The look on the faces of the other kids, how they all felt the gravity that the name held. He almost forgot how tired that boy's eyes looked. Arthur lived the quiet life of a middle management banker in the city. He went to work, he came home. He never saw anyone on the way back, not without an appointment and a 24-hour reminder. Private. But Arthur, introverted as ever, was a man of some social significance. A year ago, he met a woman who resembled everything his mother ever warned him about. This, in effect, was a form of endorsement. What Arthur could never have expected was that the woman he was fraternizing with regularly, and rather carelessly, was married to the city's mayor. This quickly became something of a massive scandal, costing the mayor incumbent the election. 6 weeks after Mayor Osmond gave his resignation, his family was seen leaving town. It was the last time that anyone would see the Osmond family. Their car was found several miles out of city limits. Linda found dead in the passenger seat, her throat slit. The children and Mayor Osmond nowhere to be found. A suspected murder-suicide. It was, presumably, brought on by the social humiliation and the infidelity. 4 months later, and Arthur still got emails from the online gossip colonists asking for a new statement about the murder-suicide. Arthur never responded. Of course he didn't. Why should he? It's not like Arthur was the one who pulled the trigger. He never knew that she was married, least of all to a major public figure. And as soon as the scandal came to light, as soon as he was made aware of what he was unknowingly participating in, Arthur called the whole engagement off, before throwing his phone into the river. Arthur severed ties with everyone. Anyone who knew Linda, knew her husband, his friends and colleagues from university. He couldn't live with the pity they had for him, the morbid curiosity they always shared, the strange questions they would never want asked of them, but were frequently employed as icebreakers. Hey, you're Arthur, right? Aren't you the guy who fucked a marriage to death? He was paraphrasing, he would admit, but the formula was there. It was now, in his bed at 6 a.m., that he was recalling the events of the prior year, recalling the countless mistakes, the immeasurable heartbreaks, and the constant disappointments that people provided him. It was no surprise that Arthur lived a completely private life. So why then, Arthur wondered to himself, could he hear someone breathing outside of his bedroom door? Arthur didn't move a muscle, didn't even dare to make a sound, but instead tilted his head up ever so slightly to see that he was alone in his bedroom. The red display of his alarm clock, illuminating the objects in his room with an evil tinge, casting shadows of horrible creatures with spindly fingers and wiry hair. He must have imagined it, must have been half asleep and still dreaming when he heard it. It couldn't have been breathing. But there it was again, just as strong and distinct as the first. Long, ragged breaths, as if the lungs in this person's body were filled with something thick. Every cell in Arthur's body was electric, every nerve in his body on high alert, the hair on his arms, legs, and the nape of his neck standing on edge as if he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. He couldn't help but think to himself that this must be what deer felt like, staring into the headlights of an oncoming vehicle, powerless in the face of something you have no comprehension of. Like looking into the eyes of God and finding that his expression is one of hatred and not love. The breathing suddenly stopped all at once, and for several painful minutes, the only sound that Arthur could hear was the dripping of his bathroom sink. Then, a massive roar that rocked the very foundation of Arthur's home. He could feel his bed rocking back and forth, vibrating from the force of the sound, a sensation he had only felt once during an earthquake. He stifled out a short yelp, covering it with his hands as the sound escaped his lips. A primal sound, one made by an animal informing the members of its pack that a more dangerous predator is near. A reaction baked into our DNA by our ancestors who slept in caves, which were frequented by hungry wild animals. It was at this moment that suddenly Arthur understood the stories his grandmother had told him about things that came bumping in the night to take away naughty children. There was the sound of something yelping out in pain, a break of something that sounded like bone, and the sound of something heavy and wet slamming against the floor. Still, the door remained untouched and undisturbed. Arthur began to wonder once again if he must be experiencing auditory hallucinations, imagining that something was behind his door, but too terrified to open it and check. After several more moments of silence and the sound of sloughing wet material striking his hardwood floors left his memory, Arthur began to feel more confident that he had come completely to consciousness. He slowly stood up out of bed, still feeling the need to be cautious. Placing his feet slowly on the ground, half expecting rotting hands to shoot out from under his bed and grip his ankles, Arthur slowly came to stand at his bedside. He turned slowly to face the door, waited several moments for something to happen, for something to break his confidence. But no breathing, no growling, no bones breaking, only silence. Not a single sound. He took a step, heard the creak of the wood underneath his feet slightly, and waited several more moments. Again, he was greeted with complete quiet. He took another step, and then another, feeling his confidence begin to swell. He got within a few steps of the door before a thought suddenly occurred to him. Something felt wrong. He couldn't quite peg down what it was, but it reminded him of when he would forget his wallet on the nightstand. There was some small detail he was missing, and as he took another step towards the door, he realized what it was. His sink. Why wasn't it dripping anymore? Suddenly, the pipes in the walls began to creak and strain. He could hear the steel swelling just underneath the thin plaster walls. It made the walls in his bedroom look as if they were breathing, swelling up and down like ineffective lungs. Then, there was the sound of a crack, a crash, and the rushing of water. Arthur began to slowly step away from the door, making his way back to the safety of his bed. The sound of rushing water increased in strength, and pretty soon, Arthur was able to see what appeared to be a muddy, red substance, the consistency of warm syrup, creeping in through the crack under his door. He stared at it, with abject terror as it continued to stream in, stretching out first a few inches from the door, then several feet, making the puddle a small pool. "What do you fucking want?" Arthur called out to whatever had come to his home in the dead of the night, unsure of what he would do if he received an answer. But as the desperate plea left his lips, the sound of the rushing water subsided. The pool, quickly making its way towards his bed, ceased all movement. It was odd to him that liquid, if that's what this was, could just stop flowing suddenly. The moment of silence was quickly filled with the voice of someone he did not know coming from beyond the door. "Will you let me in?" Arthur did not answer. Couldn't, in fact, as the air had left his body. Whatever this thing was, it spoke to him, clearly and in English. But it sounded like a man, his voice like rocks tumbling down a mountain. "What if I don't want to let you in?" he asked nervously. "You will, when you realize the alternative." The voice was certain, matter of fact, even. He tried to process the information, considered his options, and formulated a response. For now, he needed more data. He needed to have some idea of what he was dealing with. "What are you?" It was the next logical question. "Can't you guess? You called me here, didn't you?" Was that true? Had Arthur truly called this creature here just by remembering a story from his childhood? El Coco, the Kukui, the boogeyman, the visitor. He remembered the dead look in that little boy's eyes, remembered that 3 weeks before his parents had died in a horrible accident, just before he was being transferred to a new school. 11 years old, no friends, no family, suddenly in an entirely new state and school. And the thing he was most terrified of? The visitor. "What do you want?" "I want to come in." "Then why can't you?" "Because you have to let me in. That's how this works. The visitor's voice took on an amused quality to it, as if he was aware of some joke that Arthur wasn't, or as if he were playing to an audience. "Believe it or not, Arthur, you called me here. You brought me to this place. And once called, I cannot be sent back. I must be invited in, or you must forfeit that which holds the most value." "What does that mean? What am I forfeiting if I don't let you in?" Arthur pleaded. He hated not knowing the rules to whatever game this thing was playing. But for whatever reason, he was safe in here. This thing couldn't get in on its own, even if it wanted to. But he had to know what would happen if he didn't play by the visitor's games. "What's to stop me from leaving my room or just waiting until morning?" "Morning will not come, and if you would like to leave, that is perfectly allowed. Only choose whether you would like to use the front door or the window. Personally, I'm partial to the door." The door started to rattle, and with it, the floating shelves along his walls adorned with his school awards and collectibles. The figures, still bound in their packaging, came tumbling to the ground, some splintering open, breaking the toy inside into several pieces, scattering them across the room. He watched a framed picture of his grandmother fall to the ground, the glass shattering on impact, the wood frame breaking into two pieces. Arthur let out a tormented scream, unable to maintain his composure. He had never felt terror like this. It felt like his heart, beating as fast as it was, would stop beating at any moment. His chest felt like it was being gripped in a vice, and he could swear that he was on the edge of passing out. He was brought back to reality by the sound of laughing. He watched as the pool of maroon liquid suddenly began to retreat backwards under the door, as if there was some kind of sponge or vacuum system sucking the substance back up. And there, on the floor in front of his bed, a cell phone. His cell phone. What the fuck? "I told you. You called me here." Arthur couldn't breathe, couldn't focus on anything but the pounding of his heart in his chest. It felt like it was fighting to get out, to abandon him to whatever fate was awaiting him. "Pick it up," the voice, like rolling thunder, said. Arthur hesitated, looking back down at the floor and the darkness beneath his bed. Now he truly did believe that something may reach out and grab him, but the alternative was angering the visitor. So, he gingerly placed his bare foot on the ground, and after several agonizing seconds of waiting, felt secure enough in his lack of bed monsters to place the other foot down. Walking over, he knelt beside his cell phone. The screen was cracked in one spot, but otherwise, it looked mostly untouched. Surprising, he thought, considering he had chucked it into the river. He could still remember that day. The news had just broken about their affair, and Linda had all but pretended that he didn't exist. And standing there in the freezing cold winter, the rushing water beneath the bridge out of town sending a frigid mist into his face, he couldn't help but feel betrayed. Linda had always told him that they would leave together one day, that they would get married as soon as she got away from her husband, as soon as she got custody of the kids, as soon as the time was right. The time, it appeared, would never be right. They had played with the idea once, getting married. They mused about it one night laying under the sheets, Arthur tracing patterns on her shoulders. "What do you think you would wear?" Linda chuckled. "I don't think I've ever seen you in a suit. Can you even tie a proper Windsor knot?" "I'll have you know that my grandmother did in fact teach me how to tie a tie." Is that right? It sounds weird, like there should be another verb for tying a tie. Just sounds silly. Linda laughed gently, before pushing her head into his chest. Her hair smelled like honey and cinnamon. "I'm never going to meet your grandmother, am I?" No. She passed away a long time ago. I think she would have liked you. She always had a good read on people. That, and she could always spot a haunted house. Every time we would pass one, she would say some old Cuban lady bruja shit about el mal de ojo or spiritos malos. She sounds like she was amazing. The best. Arthur snapped back to reality, seeing the cracked screen of the cell phone he was still holding. He suddenly felt sick to his stomach, but didn't voice his discomfort. What am I supposed to do with this? Turn it on. He held still for a moment, before swiping his finger against the screen, hoping that nothing would happen. But he wouldn't be so lucky. The screen lit up and unlocked to reveal his screensaver. A picture of his grandmother, holding him up in the air so that he could grab clothes off of a laundry line. It had been his screensaver ever since she passed. He glanced at the screen, the image surprisingly clear, and noted that there was an error indication on the top next to his notification banner. Written across the screen in small, nearly opaque text, he saw the message, "Failure to authenticate." I can't open it. The face scanner must be broken or something. Or it doesn't recognize you anymore. The message felt ominous, and was maybe even a bit of an insult. He began turning the phone over in his hand, inspecting its various surfaces, when he heard a chime. He quickly turned the phone back around and saw on his screen a single text message. It was from Linda, and in all capital letters. Help me. He dropped the phone on the ground and turned his head towards the door. He could feel it just beyond the thin layer of plywood watching him. Was it amused? Pleased by his terror and misery? He couldn't be certain. But now he was flooded with a new emotion. Rage. Just what the fuck is this? Are you trying to torture me before you do whatever the fuck it is you're here to do? My purpose here is self-explanatory, Arthur. Did you see her text? You should really respond. No. Fuck you. I'm not playing this game with you. I refuse to take part in this. Linda is dead. Her psycho husband slit her throat and disappeared. She's gone. Chime. Another message. Arthur froze. He didn't dare to move, didn't dare to look down at the phone that he knew was at his feet. She sounded rather desperate in her first message, don't you think, Arthur? The entity beyond the door chided. It was taking pleasure in this, all right, but he knew that there was only one way out of this, to play this game until it was bored enough to leave. He reached down, gripped the phone in his hand, and turned it over. Brightly displayed on the screen was a new message. He's coming. Please. I'm scared. Could it really be Linda? Or was this thing just playing some cruel joke on him before it took him to whatever hell it crawled out of? He swiped his fingers across the screen a couple times, attempting somehow to unlock the screen manually. He couldn't respond to her message on his screensaver, couldn't call the police. His phone was as useful as a brick. I swear to God, if you somehow have her, if you're doing anything to her, I swear to Christ! Neither are present, unfortunately. Perhaps their invitations got lost in the mail. Or maybe they simply burned the invite. Really though, Arthur, this is your party. It's your job to have fun, not to force your guests to provide all the entertainment. Fuck you! Ask yourself, Arthur, why am I here? If not to serve some greater purpose, then what? Have you ever seen a miracle? Water to wine, 5 loaves and 2 fish? No? Well, then maybe you should stop praying to entities you've never seen and focus on me instead. I'm very, very real, and I'm right here with you. All you have to do is let me in. And if I let you in, what will happen? The kid who told me about you, he told me what you did to his parents. Is that what you're going to do to Linda? To me? Perhaps. But you'll have to open the door to find out. Arthur felt his blood boiling. How much more of this could he take? He walked back to his bed, sat down, and listened for the dripping of his sink. He stared absent-mindedly into the screen of his cell phone, at the message displayed therein. For some reason, he couldn't help but remember the day his abuela died. She was 98 years old, a fantastic age for a woman who grew up in Havana, malnourished and pressed under the thumb of her militant government. She had grown up in a small neighborhood, where the houses sat on steep hills made mostly of concrete and granite. It was those streets, those houses with their unforgiving surfaces, that raised her to be the strong woman he loved to this day. She had taught him everything about being a man, at least all the things his father never seemed willing to. Senora Rosie, the neighborhood called her. Everyone back home knew who she was and loved her. She would cook food for the homeless and leave plates for them outside of her home, same for the stray cats and dogs. She would go to neighbors' homes and cleanse them with her old bruja magic that she swore worked wonders. But as strong as she was, not even an all-powerful witch like her could withstand the trials of time. On her 76th birthday, she fell and broke her hips. By her 80th, she couldn't walk anymore. And by her 90th, her mind had started to go with the rest of her health. That is to say, out the window. It tore him apart to see her in such pain all the time, to watch her get confused about simple things, forgetting what channel her favorite novelas were on, losing track of her medication and if she had taken them, forgetting his name. It was hard. Probably the hardest thing he ever did, putting her in a home at 95. But he felt that with the level of support she needed, he just couldn't maintain his own life and take care of her. He still maintained daily visits with her until he was 27. And then the visits started to decrease in frequency. Once or twice a week, and then once or twice a month, to sometimes just a phone call. He hadn't thought about it for a long time now, but he felt a pang of guilt strike him in his chest. What he would give, he thought to himself, to hear her voice right now. Chime. Another message flashing across his screen, this time partially cut off because of its length. Arthur, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was never my intention to hurt you. I just needed you to know that The message cut off. Aren't you going to reply? Poked the voice again. This time, he sounded more together? Whole? It was an odd nuance that he was able to pick up, and the voice was now starting to sound more human. Familiar even. I already told you that I can't. Why don't you just tell me what the hell all of this is about? Did you love her? What? The question caught him off guard. He had never considered it, but he supposed he did. They had planned for a future together, seen each other every week for several months, sometimes twice in one day. But was that love? He knew the sex was electric, the conversations equally as charged, but while he enjoyed her time, he never thought of Linda as his. He always suspected that one day or another, she would sort things out with her husband, or find a new, more interesting partner to occupy her time with. He supposed that he didn't love her. But then what was this pain in his chest? Have you ever heard of Dante's Inferno? It's the story of a man who journeys into hell to recover the soul of the woman he loves. She's been sent to hell for leading a life of sin, and he refuses to leave her to her fate. What does that have to do with anything? Well, the entire time he's walking through hell, taking in its immeasurable suffering, he has a guide. A man who walks with him and makes the nightmares make sense. He was the great poet Virgil, the real-life Dante's idol. Think of yourself as Dante right now. You're wandering through hell, trying desperately to make sense of it all. And what? You're Virgil? No. I'm hell. Just waiting on the other side of this door. One choice away from having you. One choice away from you letting me in. And then, Dante, you can see what it was all for. So that's it. I'm being punished for what happened to Linda and her family? How was I supposed to know? She never told me she was still with her husband. All I know was that they had a terrible fight and she came to me for help. She came to you for comfort in the form of raunchy hotel sex. The only one who had any illusions about her being an innocent and delicate flower was you, lover boy. So what was I supposed to fucking do? Play 20 questions, interrogate her, force her to tell me that she was still fucking her husband and making her kids lunch bags before coming to visit? So, you did hate her children. No, I didn't. I never got to meet them. They weren't. No. You know what? Fuck this. Fuck you. I don't have to put up with this. You're not real. You're some figment of my imagination, something I ate that didn't agree with my stomach. You can't be real. This is all too fucking crazy. There was sudden silence. No sound anymore. Not even the dripping of the faucet. And it made his blood freeze in his veins. He glanced over towards the door, waited for it to burst open, to reveal some horrible and hideous entity, for the wood to splinter open and reveal the corpse of Linda's dead husband. Imagined what his body would look like at this point after months of decaying somewhere even the police could never find. His rotten eyes peering through the crack in the door, like the scene out of The Shining. But there was nothing. He stood up cautiously, walked over to the door and leaned his ear against it, trying to hear anything on the other side of it, even if it was just breathing. What he heard instead confused him. Crying. The sound of what could only be a grown man crying. He could hear the man mumbling under his voice. The words completely unintelligible. Chime. He nearly jumped out of his own skin. The crying on the other side of the door ceased altogether, and he backed away again, towards his bed. He leaned against the small iron railing and looked at his phone's dimly lit screen again, the battery now below 20%. The red battery symbol flashing ever so slightly. He glanced down at the new message once more, this one also cut off due to its length. He has my kids, Arthur. Please, you have to know what you meant to me, what all of it meant to me. Being with you was the last time I ever felt truly normal. You... He started to weep. He couldn't contain it anymore. The tears started to come. Good. You're almost ready to let me in, said the disembodied voice on the other side of the door now. Arthur didn't care anymore. He continued to weep. He cried over how hopeless it all felt, how meaningless his life had been up until this point, trying to find meaning in his job with Linda. He spent most of his early 20s taking care of his grandmother. He never had time to just be a kid. His mother wasn't able, and he was also the only breadwinner in his household. So while his friends went out and drank and partied, he stayed home or went to work. That changed when he met Linda. She was crying on a park bench. He walked through the park every day to feed the birds, But that day, he found her instead. They stared at each other at first, neither saying a word. Her face was covered in snot and tears, her makeup running for the hills. He didn't have a handkerchief to offer, so he took off his sweater and held it in the air with what Linda described as the kind of smile a guy gives you when he's trying to convince you he isn't a threat. It made her burst out laughing, and he just stood there, taking it in. Her laugh wasn't cute like they tell you it will be in movies. It was unguarded, authentic. The kind of laugh that would show your dentist if you had any cavities. He started to laugh too. And then they had just spoken for hours. They exchanged phone numbers, went their separate ways, and for 3 months he didn't hear from her. But on the 7th day of the 3rd month, he received a desperate phone call. Linda had gotten into a physical argument with her husband. He had bruised her up pretty bad, and she was hardly able to speak over the phone without sobbing uncontrollably. He drove 3 hours out of his way to pick her up. He didn't even remember agreeing to do so, or hearing her ask him to, but nonetheless, they met up, and he took her to a hotel where he made a hot bath for her, and they made love for the first time. So you did love her then? Wait, what? Said Arthur, his stream of consciousness suddenly getting interrupted by the visitor. You just said it. You made love to her. So you did have feelings for her, despite your best efforts. And before even the first time. Bit eager of you, isn't it? Just a tad desperate. You're in my head. Is that so surprising? Come on. Surely you've grasped it by now, Arthur. Get out of my fucking head! You're not real. None of this is real. Not the phone, not you, not Lynn. Chime. Arthur looked down again, his eyes wild and frenzied with rage and desperation now. There was a new message from Linda, yes, but at the top of the screen, he could see a new message, where once it said, failed to authenticate. Scanning, it said. And then suddenly, the screen opened up and he could see all of Linda's messages in front of him. Could see the date and timestamp as well. The messages were from a year ago, the day that Mayor Osmond was seen leaving town. 2:13 a.m. Help me. 2:23 a.m. He's coming, please. I'm scared. 2:26 a.m. Arthur, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was never my intention to hurt you. I just need you to know that I never intended to keep any of this from you. But we just keep seeing each other, and I didn't want to ruin it. Arthur felt his head start to spin. He started to feel dizzy and nauseous, his equilibrium suddenly off kilter. He felt unusually cold, like he just came from the outside, the chill setting into his bones and rattling them in his skin. What is this? This is from the day that that son of a bitch. It was you, wasn't it? You did this to her. It's you, Mayor Osmond, isn't it? No, I already told you, Arthur. I'm Hell, and you are Dante. You must pass through fire, and give up all hope, ye who enter here. Suddenly, there was the sound of rushing water again. From under the door, liquid started to pool and rapidly crawl its way towards him. Arthur jumped onto his bed as the water continued to pour in endlessly. No, you said you can't come in unless I let you in. I haven't done it yet. You're not allowed to come in. Arthur, you're not done reading yet. Arthur tried to steady his breathing. The water was continuing to rise, but the door stayed secured. He still had a chance to get out. He ran over to the windows, tugged at them to try and get them to open. But when he pulled the blinds open and looked outside, he couldn't understand what he was seeing. Everything was cast in a gray-blue light. The street lamps below his second-story bedroom outside turned off, the grass swaying oddly. Wait, no, not grass. Kelp, or seaweed? And then, a river bass suddenly swam into his vision, floating through the air. No, not air. Water? I told you. You could choose the window or the front door. You still haven't read all of your messages, Arthur. Arthur turned on his heel toward the voice, and then back to the window. Panic was starting to set in again. Was he underwater? How was that possible? His whole house under water. He kept tugging at the window, trying to pry it open, but he couldn't get it free. He glanced at his nightstand and his alarm clock. He wrenched it out of the wall and swung it above his head like an impromptu flail. He swung it with all of his force into the window several times. The window never even so much as cracked. Just tell me what you want. Tell me what I have to do. Oh, I don't have an answer to that, Arthur. That's something you'll have to figure out. Are you going to open the window and jump? Or are you going to open the door and let me in? If I let you in, will you kill me? It's a possibility, Arthur. Arthur grabbed his head in his hands and let out a mournful scream. He looked over at the window and then back at the door. Finally, his eyes landed back on the cell phone. He ran over to it, the water in the room now at knee height. He swiped open the screen and continued reading. 2:30 a.m. He has my kids, Arthur. Please, you have to know what you meant to me. What all of it meant to me. Being with you was the last time I ever felt truly normal. You made me feel like I was human. Like I wasn't used up and broken. It's not your job to do that for anyone, but you did it for me. And I wish I had messaged you sooner, but I figured you hated me. I love you, Arthur. Please. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Arthur caught his breath. Not just because of the content of the messages, but because he realized now that he remembered reading this before. In fact, in his message thread, he could clearly see that he had read these messages nearly a year ago. He became more confused and suddenly had a question for the visitor. The water, now waist height, made it difficult to move, but he made his way to the door, wading through the murky liquid as it continued to fill up his living space. What happened to her? Tell me the truth. Did you have anything to do with this? No. I was completely innocent. I never could have known. The response suddenly lit a light bulb in Arthur's mind. He quickly turned back to the phone, reading the next message. 2:32 a.m. He's got me locked up in the guest bathroom. He tied my hands but didn't do a great job, so I managed to get out. Luckily, he forgot to take my phone from me. I don't know if you're angry with me and ignoring me or if you're just asleep, but I guess I deserve this. I lied to you. I kept my husband's identity a secret, but I want you to know that you were the singular greatest thing in my life. I love you, Arthur. Please, forgive me. Life is unfair. It takes, and it takes, and it takes. There's no rhyme or reason to the cruelty. We're all just flotsam and jetsam in the great sea that is the human experience. Just trying not to drown or crash and splinter into pieces. Sometimes the end is painless. Sometimes it's brutal and horrific. and none of us ever know which it'll be," the visitor said. He sounded resigned, tired, like he just finished a boxing match. He continued, "It's so easy for us to point the blame at anyone else but ourselves, to see the cruelty and say, well, not my problem. Why should I care? I had no part in it. It's surely not my fault. Me, completely without fault." Arthur started to speak, picking up where the visitor left off. "I abandoned my grandmother. I abandoned Linda. I left them to die a cruel, lonely death. How am I supposed to live with that?" "You try. You do what you can every day, each day, until you can't anymore. And then you keep fighting anyway." "I'm just so tired." "I know, Arthur. I'm so sorry." "What are you?" "I think you already know, Arthur. Come on, bud. One more message to read. Then, it's time to make a choice. Just remember, it's always harder climbing down." The room fell silent, the water still rising and now just above his chest. Arthur looked at the screen, tears still streaming out of his eyes, trying to see through the salty liquid at Linda's final message. 2:41 a.m. "He came in and gave me something to make me sleep. I don't think I'll ever wake up again. I just want you to know, Arthur, I was so excited to give my whole future to you. I love you, and I'm so sorry. Please, when you wake up and see these messages, don't blame yourself. This isn't your fault. You are completely innocent. You never could have known. I love you. Goodbye, Arthur." The water finally crested over Arthur's head, and he was submerged beneath the briny substance. He felt his body slowly lift off the ground and he began to float, feeling his head just hit the ceiling before he bobbed uselessly in the water. He threw a glance toward the window, and then back at the door. Decision time. He swam toward the door, gripping his hands on the knob. The water was freezing and biting into his flesh. He could feel his eyes stinging with the cold as he tightened his fist around the knob. He pulled against the door, trying to get it open, but it wouldn't move. It was like it was frozen in place. It's always harder climbing down. Arthur placed his feet on either side of the door, on the adjoining walls. He tightened his fist around the doorknob again and began to pull, throwing his legs and back into the equation. He strained so hard that he could feel the veins in his neck starting to pop with the force of his pulling. He could feel the air in his lungs starting to burn now, the phone slowly floating away from him, spinning slowly as if in space, showing him the picture of Senora Rossi, holding up a little boy who loved to pull down freshly washed laundry. He thought about the day she taught him how to tie a tie, thought about all the conversations he had with Linda all the way into the wee hours of the morning, thought about all the times he laughed so hard with her that he couldn't see straight. It was beautiful. His life had been beautiful. With the last of his strength, he pulled one more time, the air escaping his lungs, bubbling out of his mouth, letting the water in, as the door slowly started to peel open and he could see light pour through, and a voice calling him. "Hey, asshole! Get the hell down from there! What the fuck do you think you're doing? You trying to die?" Arthur snapped his head up suddenly. He looked around him, out to the trees that outlined the river in front of him, felt the freezing mist splash his face, looked down at the rushing waters and a man standing on the bridge, flailing his arms. In his right hand, his cell phone, broken, with a huge crack in one portion of the screen. "Hey, buddy, come on, man, don't do it, please. You got someone I can call? Come on, let's just have a chat." Arthur looked at the man, dumbly. He couldn't think of anything to say, so he just said, I think I want to come down." All right, that's great. Just be careful, man. It's always harder coming down. I'll be down here. Take it slow and easy. Arthur did just that, slowly making his way down the beams and supports before reaching the ground. The man, Arthur could now see, was a man in his late 50s. Arthur looked out at the river and then back down at his phone. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a paperclip, removing the memory stick. What are you doing there, bud?" Arthur didn't answer, but instead chucked the phone into the river, hearing it crack against the rocks before splashing into the water, never to be seen again. "What I came here to do," he answered quietly. "Oh, okay then. That's all you came here to do?" Arthur shook his head. "No, that wasn't all I came out here to do." Well, I'm glad I came then. Let me take you back home. You live in the town just a ways off?" Yeah, I do." "All right, well, I only got 2 rules about riding with me. No guns and no rolling down the window." "Got it." They walked over to the man's truck, which was parked in the nearby snowbank, the same place that Linda's body was found. He stood still outside the passenger side door, looking into the forest beyond, listening to the river. He pulled the door open and then sat down in the passenger seat before asking, "Hey, do you have a phone? Mind if I make a call real quick?" he asked the stranger. Sure. Here, go for it." Arthur grabbed the man's flip phone, typed in a 9-digit number, and waited before he heard someone answer. Hey. Yeah, it's me. I'm sorry I haven't called in a while. I've just been really busy. No, I'm not. I'm really not okay.
The Piper's Burden. Written by Sakinah Jonas-Mawji. Narrated by Jeff Clement. Tell me something spooky, the little girl pleaded with her mother, her green eyes wide and unblinking. It was Halloween, and at 8 years old, she had discovered ghouls and ghosts and all things that go bump in the night, and embraced it. An only child, she sat on the floor across from her mother, their jack-o'-lantern carved, a flickering candle lighting its gnarly grin and demon eyes perched between them, casting shadows. She munched on treats she had collected from her neighbors earlier that night, legs crossed in her witch's costume. Her mother smiled indulgently at her young daughter's open excitement. Okay, she told her daughter. There is one story I was told when I was younger, and I was told it was real. Do you want to hear it? She inquired. Is it spooky? Her daughter asked her. Oh yes, her mother replied. It's very spooky. She smiled again as her daughter's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. Oh, please tell me, her little daughter begged. Okay then, her mother laughed. Here it is. Edmund Piper had endured a difficult life. As a child, pasty-faced, slight-framed and shy, he had been bullied mercilessly. His school bag had been thrown into the toilet, his action men had their arms ripped off, and he had suffered constant taunting and finger-pointing from the other kids. He had felt hopeful when he got to high school that maybe he would now be able to make some friends. Everyone seemed to have them. He would have been happy with just one friend. Someone he could talk to and spend some time with. But it hadn't happened. Instead, he shut himself in his bedroom at home with only himself and the memory of his little brother, 2 years younger than him, who had died young and who he missed dreadfully. Brian had known him and understood what it was to be different. He was accepting of Edmund, and that had been enough. And although his little brother had been the apple of his mother's eye, Edmund hadn't minded. Brian was a loving and affectionate child who had learned to communicate with Edmund through sounds and hand movements, and had treated Edmund as his equal, something that nobody else had ever done. Brian had been born with a defect that affected his speech and coordination. As he got older, his limbs became twisted, making it impossible for him to play as other children would. But Edmund had always taken care of him. Then, when Edmund was just 7 years old, he and Brian had been out walking in the woods with their father. It was a rare trip, as his father was often too busy making money to spend time with his children. One moment, Edmund had been collecting autumn leaves of red and brown to show his mother, and the next moment, there had been a cry of horror from his father. Brian had fallen into the old, dry well by the shallow river and broken his neck. His poor coordination had stopped him from saving himself, and their mother had blamed her husband for the negligence of their disabled child. Edmund remembered very little of what happened, as he had been overwhelmed by the loss of his only friend and playmate. His father had become very distant and cold, and his mother had suffered a breakdown. Edmund had not only lost his brother, but also his mother, who had become unstable and would wander aimlessly, talking to herself and spending her time alone in Brian's room. Many nights, she would wake screaming for her dead child, crying loudly in sorrow at his loss. There were no more bedtime stories, no more picnics in the sun, no more motherly hugs when he felt sad because of school. His father had employed a housekeeper then, and Edmund had been all but forgotten in his childhood years. High school was a continuation of his elementary school. As well as having his possessions damaged, his lunch money stolen, and becoming the favorite target in hockey to have his ankles painfully beaten by his jeering classmates each week. On one occasion, he had even had his nose broken. Life was cruel, and Edmund had learned this from a very young age. His father had always had expectations of him that he could never hope to meet, and had left him the Piper family business out of a sense of duty, so the boy wouldn't go destitute and bring shame onto the Piper name. Even then, it was only because his father had no other child to leave it when he died. His mother, in her lucid moments, had been kinder, in that she had excused Edmund's natural inability to achieve his dreams, telling him that not everybody could be somebody in life. His mother had meant well, where his father had washed his hands of his inept son when Edmund had failed his second year of his university degree, and his only option left was to learn about the workings of the Piper business. Clearly, his father had scolded him, he would never manage to survive on his own. Over time, his mother's demeanor improved. She benefited from the many therapists and doctors that his father insisted she see, and finally, his mother returned to him. She was different, sterner, and she smiled a lot less, but occasionally, glimpses of her previous charms would seep through, and Edmund believed that one day she would return to her former self. His parents' deaths had been unfortunate and unexpected. A car accident one foggy night on a narrow road. They had never seen the oncoming truck, the police said, and the truck had not seen them. There was very little of the car left, and their deaths had been instant. Edmund had been at home as usual that night. His parents had been traveling home from one of their many trips away. His father believed it was good for his mother to have a regular change of scene, and Edmund quietly believed the trips were his father's way of trying to win his wife's forgiveness for the loss of Brian. Suddenly, there was nothing left, and Edmund's life was plunged into darkness. The reclusive 21-year-old had inherited the Piper fortune, and his relatives had been pitying of him, making all the usual pretenses of giving their condolences. The truth was, he barely knew any of them, and he had no interest in getting to know them now. His grandfather, an arthritic, fierce-looking man, had approached him at his parents' funeral and had given him a long, hard look.
"They will come to you one day, as they came to all of us, but you must be stronger than we were, and say no. You're the only one left,"
he stated. Then he squeezed Edmund's shoulder and walked slowly away. Edmund had been greatly surprised by this and not known what to make of it, as he barely knew the old man. But he quickly forgot his grandfather's words as grief overwhelmed him. He had remained living at the family mansion for a further few more months before buying a small house in another town where maybe he could start over again, away from the shadow that loomed over his childhood home. He missed the open grounds his parents had kept looking so pristine, and the woods behind the mansion. He especially missed the old dry well by the shallow river that ran through the woods, where many an afternoon he had lounged in his summer breaks, reading and listening to the bird song, eating sandwiches and talking to his lost little brother. That the well was dry had made his brother's death so much more painful to accept. Maybe, if there had been water in it, his brother could have thrashed and stayed above the surface until he was rescued. He was surprised he didn't miss his parents very much, but reminded himself he had lost them both many years before their deaths, when Brian had been taken from them. It was time to move on, he decided, and he took that first step into the world alone. The new, smaller home would be a fresh start for him. He would finally make something of himself, especially now that he had the money to do so. So he bought a little brick house with a small country garden and got to work with his newly acquired business. Thankfully, the running of it was mainly done by the numerous employees his father had taken on, and who had provided their loyal service for many years, and Edmund saw no reason to change this. He instead busied himself with painting, a hobby he had always enjoyed, and one his father had always been disdainful of, because, after all, where would painting get him? Edmund no longer cared. He turned one room of his comfortable home into a studio and started to paint. He was good at it, and he did it for himself, and it made him happy. Over time, he had enough of his artwork to exhibit and became known in his own right as a landscape painter. His work was sought after by some and appreciated by others. The Piper business continued to provide him with a profit to live on, and he allowed his art to become his purpose. Finally, he had found some peace in his lonely world. Eventually, Edmund met a quiet woman named Heather, with beautiful long red hair and sparkling green eyes. She possessed a voice that could break through even the darkest of his moods, and like him, shared a passion for art. They had a quiet wedding at a beautiful church in the nearby village, and over the next 6 years, Edmund and Heather had 2 children together. First came a girl who they named Maria after Heather's grandmother, and then a boy who they named Anthony after Edmund's father. Anthony had almost died during childbirth, but the doctors had managed to skillfully save him, and their little family was complete. It was some years later when Edmund ventured back to that dust-covered mansion. Memories, brought to him in dreams, had spurred him into action as he packed up their belongings and drove his family across that long distance to step back into his past. Edmund and his wife settled back into the home he had left behind him, and their family enjoyed the solitude the mansion provided for them. Their children could play in their vast grounds, and Edmund had a much bigger studio for him and his wife to paint in. However, it was some time after Edmund moved home that the dreams commenced. Initially, they were short and left him feeling confused. Brian would appear, and he and Edmund would be playing as children. When he awoke, he was filled with a sense of sadness, and he missed the younger brother that had accepted him all those years ago. It was to be expected, he decided, as he left behind so many memories when he had moved away and never really dealt with how he felt about his childhood. Over time, though, the dreams increased and became darker. Brian became demanding, wanting to know why Edmund had forgotten him. He asked Edmund where he had gone and why he had let him die. Edmund would awake feeling afraid of the anger Brian had demonstrated towards him, and uneasy at the fact that Brian, who had never been able to speak in life, was shouting at him in his nightmares. In one dream, Brian appeared and was singing a nursery rhyme that Edmund had sung to Brian when they were children. But it was changed now, the words much darker. Down by the river where the green grass grows, there sits a well, but nobody knows that inside we scream our song of pain as we shriek for our new playmates to join in our game. Edmund didn't understand, but the dreams continued, and Brian began to appear with his neck broken, blood covering his tiny face and matting his hair, his head hanging at an unnatural angle as he advanced on Edmund, demanding a playmate. Edmund would awake coated in a cold sweat and breathing heavily in fear. It was the crying that was the worst part to deal with. The lonely, anguished sobs of a small child that he would hear each night that nobody else appeared to notice, and it haunted him. On many occasions, he searched the mansion, going from room to room, looking for the owner of such pitiful sobs. Edmund became withdrawn, and even Heather could not coax a smile from him. He snapped at the children, and he snarled to be left alone when she approached him. Their marriage suffered, and he took a separate bedroom so that he could be away from the pitying gaze of his once beloved wife. He continued to paint, but his art became morbid. Often he would finish a painting and then feel sickened at what he saw. A dark forest with red leaves on the trees, dripping with blood. The wishing well with a small, broken body in it. A noose hanging from the oak tree that stood beside the well. With no recollection of his paint-stained hands creating such horrors, he angrily tore the canvases and tossed them to one side. It was during one such rampage that he knocked over a drawer unit. As he wearily picked it back up, a small drawer popped open to reveal a book, which, on closer inspection, revealed itself to be a journal. Edmund sat heavily with the book in his hand. He had never seen it before, and opened it.
April 5th. I cannot sleep for dreaming of it. Always he is there, bloodied and mangled.
He wants a playmate. How can I give him one? Who would I give? I'm so tired, and I see him at every corner. Edmund was stunned. He was staring at his father's handwriting. Cautiously, he read another entry.
April 22nd.
I cannot stand it anymore. Why does nobody hear it but me when it fills each night? Is everybody deaf after dark? Always wailing of being alone. So alone. So very alone. I understand. I felt the same way when he died. But what can I do? Edmund began to shake. It was as though a light had come on in his mind, and he began to piece his thoughts together. His father wrote this journal to escape from the torments that Edmund himself was now suffering from. The dreams, the crying, it was all as if Edmund had written these entries in his own hand. His father had a brother, just the one who had died. This must be who his father was referring to. It was never spoken about in their household, and his father became tight-lipped and cold when he had asked what had happened to Uncle Simon. Edmund knew it had happened before he was born because he had never met his Uncle Simon. His mother had mentioned it to him one day after Brian had died, and his father had become furious. Edmund had not understood the reaction, the guilt and pain that had blazed in his father's eyes before the anger took hold. And it became clear they would never speak of it again. Edmund looked at the book, the ink fading, the handwriting scrawled as though written by a desperate, shaking hand. He didn't remember much of his father in his childhood. In fact, his father had rarely spent time with his children at all. And then the one time he did, Edmund thought slowly, Brian died. Edmund put the book back in the drawer and found another canvas. This painting would be different, he thought. He would stay fully conscious of his actions this time, and it would be beautiful. He sat there for several hours, though, before finally giving up, inspiration evading him, and he went to bed. Soon after he turned out the light, the sobbing started again. Low and lonely at first, and then rising in pitch and decibel until it shrieked and filled his mind completely. This went on for several nights. Edmund lay awake listening to it, trying to block it from him with pillows, but desperate not to fall asleep so he could avoid the hellish dreams that plagued him. In the end, exhaustion claimed him, and again he dreamed of Brian. And this time, Brian was raging at him.
You know what happened. You were there, and you let it happen. This is your fault,
he screamed.
You let me die. You were supposed to protect me. You left me alone with him, and then you went away.
Brian's voice became impossibly loud as he advanced on a terrified Edmund, his twisted legs jolting his movements like a puppet on strings as he held out his gore-covered hand and pointed his broken fingers at his older brother.
You're the only one who can fix this, Edmund. You're the only one who knows how.
Edmund awoke with a start and reached for his wife before realizing she was in the room opposite his, and he lay there, frozen in terror. He finally managed to find the strength to push his sweat-soaked hair from his eyes and put a lamp on to drive the darkness back a little as he went over the dream. again and again in his head. How can I fix this? He thought to himself. What can I do? Over and over in his head, the horrible nursery rhyme repeated itself. He stayed there until daylight started to touch his window, and then dragged himself into the shower, turning the water on and letting it burn his skin as much as he could bear in order to wash the horror of the dream away. Edmund eventually took himself back to his studio and waited. After many long hours, determined to find a positive inspiration that was not forthcoming, he opened the little drawer and removed his father's journal. He stared at it for a long moment and then began to read again. July 22nd. I will have to do it. There is no other way. He says, I will be free if I just let him have Brian. A playmate. That's all I have to do. It would be a kindness, really. What will become of Brian in this world anyway? He will never be able to work, never settle down with a wife or have children, never be able to care for himself. He cannot even speak. What life would he have if he lived anyway? If I do this, we will both be free from torment, and Simon will be alone no longer. The book slid from Edmund's quivering fingers as his stunned mind processed what he had just read. His whole body felt numb, and his mind was reeling in shock. His father had killed Brian, pushed him down that well on purpose. That was why Brian screamed at him in his dreams, accused him of knowing what had happened, that he had been there. He had been there. His father had killed his younger brother while he stood a mere few feet away from them, just as his grandfather must have killed his Uncle Simon. The cryptic words that his now dead grandfather had spoken to him at his parents' funeral came back to mock him.
They will come to you one day, as they came to all of us. But you must be stronger than we were, and say no. You're the only one left.
His grandfather's statement and the altered words of the nursery rhyme were suddenly clear to him then, the meanings of these messages punching at him painfully, almost as though they were physical blows, and he felt weak and sick. Memories came flooding back to Edmund, the anguish of his mother's screams when his father had told her what had happened. Her screaming and screaming and screaming. It had terrified Edmund, her disconnection from the world, his father's retreat from Edmund's childhood and hatred for him as he grew up. It all made sense. Edmund spent the remainder of the day in isolation, his children's laughter drifting up to him from time to time as they played outside, but he did not notice. He was filled with such sorrow for his helpless lost brother, who had suffered so much in his short life, with never the hint of a complaint, and then been taken from him so young, so painfully, and so abruptly. Days passed, and Edmund's demeanor worsened. He ate little and spoke not at all. When he went to bed, his head was filled with the loud, unmistakable sobs of a lonely child. And when he did fall asleep, his dreams of his brother, alone and deformed, screaming demands for company, pointing at him, accusing him, and insisting that he knew the truth and had abandoned him to spend eternity alone. Edmund slowly slipped from reality. His mind no longer made sense of his surroundings. He became emotionally despondent, lost in his own thoughts and paying no attention to his family. He lost weight, his face becoming gaunt, and would talk to himself in low, incomprehensible mutterings, and hum the tune of the nursery rhyme to himself over and over again. His dreams continued, and the sobbing grew louder until he was desperate to be free of it. In his disconnected state, His reality morphed into a frightening unreality, and he functioned robotically as he silently tried to understand and accept what he must do. Brian kept telling him he wanted Anthony, but Heather would never agree to giving him up, so we must think of a plan. Edmund looked into the mirror and shaved. He had several days' growth on his face and looked like a madman with dark circles under his sunken, bloodshot eyes. He laughed briefly, a crazed grin pasted across his sallow face as he hummed to himself. He showered and dressed and went down to sit at the breakfast table where his wife and children were surprised to see him. He smiled at each of them, helped himself to cereal and sat down. He announced his plan, that since it was such a lovely day today, maybe they should go to the woods and have a picnic, just him and the children, giving his wife the opportunity to work on her latest painting in peace. Heather, unsure of what to make of this new Edmund, a glimmer of hope in her eyes at the possible return of her husband, smiled and said she would fix something special for dinner when they came home. Edmund returned her smile, and the children ate their breakfast excitedly. Perhaps he smiled a little too much. After breakfast, Edmund helped them pack sandwiches, juice cartons, and cookies, and then set off on their day out together. They spent the morning exploring. Maria collected wildflowers she could press in books later and then give to her mother, and Anthony hunted for different shaped pebbles to add to his collection. He kept them in his pockets, and when he ran out of space, Edmund filled his own pockets with his son's new finds. As Maria wandered to a patch of primroses growing by a fallen tree trunk, she heard a scream suddenly behind her. She glanced around to see her father at the well, on his knees with his face in his palms. Her brother, nowhere to be seen. Her father was crying, but it was not the cries that frightened her. It was the maniacal laughter that punctuated her father's sobs that froze her blood in her veins. She dropped her flowers and ran to him. At the bottom of the deep, dry well by the shallow river, Anthony lay crumpled and unmoving in a pool of his own blood that seeped darkly and formed a puddle around his head. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, and in places she could see his bones protruding through his clothes. Maria began screaming and ran toward the house to fetch her mother.
If only Anthony had died when he was born, as he was obviously supposed to have.
Edmund lamented, tears running freely down his cheeks.
It never would have come to this.
He knew that he would never be free. Brian had lied to him. The dark paintings he had created had been premonitions. Brian telling him what would happen. The child's sobs now shrieked in his ears and were the last thing he heard as he made a noose and hung himself with his bootlaces from the oak tree growing beside the well, just as the painting had foretold. He was dead before little screaming Maria ever reached the mansion. Maria was raised by her maternal grandparents. Her mother had died of an accidental overdose of tranquilizers some months after the incident. Her grandparents were kind and spoiled her as often as they could in order to banish the dark memories of her past. Maria grew up into an attractive young woman with long red hair and beautiful green eyes, the spitting image of her mother, with her mother's melodic voice. She had only one child and had a fierce passion for music.
At least Maria lived and was happy in the end,
the little girl said to her mother.
I'm glad there was a bit of joy for her, even if it is a very creepy story. Does the little boy Anthony now haunt the mansion as well?
She asked. Well, her mother said in a mysterious whisper. If you wanted to, we could go and find out. Would you like that? It's Halloween, after all, she smiled. How? The little girl asked her mother, intrigued. We could go to the well, of course, her mother answered. It's not too far from here. The little girl's eyes widened with excitement. Do you think we will hear them there? She asked, whispering herself now. Oh, I'm sure we will, her mother answered. I'm certain of it. Maria took her daughter's hand and led her out into the woods in the darkness. The little girl skipped excitedly along by her mother's side, the swinging jack-o'-lantern casting shadows all around them. The prospect of hearing a real ghost almost too much for her. Soon, Maria thought, she would be free. Of the sound of the child sobbing, of the constant nightmares, and of the visions of her brother, his neck broken, his face shattered, his bones poking out of his ruined limbs, accusing her of abandoning him. Free from the curse. They would all be free, and her daughter would know the truth of why her mummy had given her over to join those little lost souls. She took comfort in this justification. There would be no more calling for the pipers to provide dead children with playmates. Once this was done, she would be the last piper alive. Well, for a short time, at least. She looked down at her lovely little daughter, smiling and singing quietly to herself as she led the way. Down by the river where the green grass grows, there sits a well, but nobody knows that inside we scream our song of pain as we shriek for our new playmates to join in our game.
Chilling tales for dark nights.